Hey, welcome back, friend. Get comfortable. Dim the lights if you haven't already. And if you're someone who likes to drift off to history, well, tonight we're going somewhere really good. Picture this. You wake up one morning in the year 1342. You have a message to deliver. 2 towns away, 40 miles, and the road between you and that destination. It hasn't been properly repaired since the Romans built it 500 years ago. There are no streetlights, no police, no phone signal obviously, no GPS, no roadside assistance, no way to call for help if something goes wrong, and something almost always goes wrong. Here's what no one ever tells you about the Middle Ages. Most people lived their entire lives without ever travelling more than 30 miles from the village where they were born. 30 miles. That's roughly the distance from Manhattan to New Haven. Their whole world, their whole life within that circle. So when someone actually packed up and left, when they stepped beyond that edge, they weren't just going on a trip. They were making a decision that could get them killed. And yet, millions of people did it, every single year. Merchants hauling silk and spices across mountain passes, soldiers marching toward wars they didn't start, diplomats carrying letters that could change the borders of entire kingdoms, students walking hundreds of miles just to sit in a classroom, and pilgrims, ordinary people, blacksmiths and bakers and mothers and monks walking to Rome, to Canterbury, to Jerusalem, places they'd only ever heard about in church. What did they carry? What did they need? And what do the things in their bags tell us about who they really were? That's exactly what we're going to explore tonight together. And honestly, it's going to surprise you. But before we go any further, if you enjoy stories like this one, the kind that make history feel alive and real and close, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and drop a like on this video. It genuinely means the world to me, and it's what keeps these stories coming. And hey, I'm curious about you. Where are you right now as you listen to this? In bed, lights off, fan running, on the couch with a cup of tea, commuting home in the dark. Leave a comment and tell me. I love hearing from you. Now turn the lights down soft, let the fan hum if you have one nearby, and let's walk this road together. Let's start the very beginning. Because before we can understand what a medieval traveller carried, we need to understand something more important. Why did they even go? And more honestly, who were these people? Because here's a misconception that Hollywood planted deep in our minds. When most of us imagine a medieval traveller, we see a knight. Gleaming armour, strong horse, a sword at his hip and a banner flying above his head. That version of medieval travel spectacular, also incredibly rare. The overwhelming majority of people who moved across medieval Europe were not knights. They were not nobles. They were ordinary people with ordinary problems and extraordinary courage. The historian Jean Verdon, in his book Travel in the Middle Ages, published in 2003 by the University of Notre Dame Press, makes a striking argument that medieval travel was far more widespread and common than most people assume. The roads of Europe, he writes, were filled with a remarkable cast of characters. Merchants, yes, but also pilgrims, monks carrying manuscripts, messengers on urgent business, students walking to the great universities, tax collectors, midwives, minstrels, prostitutes, vagabonds. The kinds of people whose names never made it into the history books, but whose footsteps wore the roads down to dust. All of them carrying something. All of them hoping to make it to the other side. Now let's talk about who specifically was on the road, because it matters enormously for understanding what they carried. The first great category of medieval traveller was the merchant. And the medieval merchant is a fascinating figure. We think of trade as something modern, as something that requires infrastructure contracts, digital payment systems. But medieval merchants were moving goods across entire continents, wool from England to Flanders, spices from Venice to Paris, wine from Bordeaux to London, and they did it on roads that sometimes disappeared entirely in the rain. Historian Peter Spufford, in his detailed study, Power and Profit, the Merchant in Medieval Europe, describes how the major trade routes of the 14th century connected cities that were hundreds of miles apart. The great champagne fairs in France drew merchants from Italy, England, Germany, and the Low Countries. Thousands of people, all converging on a single location, twice a year, across roads that had no guardrails, no maintenance crews, and no guarantee that you'd arrive in one piece. These merchants were moving serious weight, bolts of fine Flemish wool, barrels of wine, chests of silver coins, and they carried all of this sometimes on their own backs, sometimes on mules, sometimes in ox-drawn carts that jolted over every stone and rut in the road, across mountain passes through dense forests and over rivers, where the bridges were more often than not half collapsed or entirely washed away. The second great category of medieval traveller was the pilgrim, and here's where it gets deeply human. Pilgrimage in the Middle Ages was not a vacation. It was not a sightseeing tour. It was a spiritual emergency. People set out on pilgrimages because they were sick and hoped for a miracle, because they had done something terrible and needed to atone, because they had made a promise to God in a moment of desperation. If you let my child survive this fever, I will walk to Rome. And now they had to keep it. The three great pilgrimage destinations of medieval Europe were Rome, Santiago de Compostela, in what is now northwestern Spain, and Jerusalem. Jerusalem was roughly 3,000 miles from London, on foot, through hostile territory. Think about that for a moment. Someone in 14th century England, a baker say, or a weaver's widow, would stand up one morning, strap a bag to their shoulder, pick up a wooden staff and begin walking toward the Holy Land. 3,000 miles, no ticket, no hotel reservation, no travel insurance, just faith and a pair of shoes. Some of them made it, many of them didn't, and then there were the travellers that we rarely think about at all, the students. In the High Middle Ages, the great universities of Europe, Bologna, Paris, Oxford, were attracting students from across the continent. A young man from a village in southern Germany might walk hundreds of miles to reach the University of Paris, sometimes alone, sometimes in a small group, carrying a few coins, a change of clothes, and a burning desire to learn. These students were among the most vulnerable travellers on the road. They had little money. They had no noble title to protect them. They had no hired guards, and yet they walked. Because knowledge in the Middle Ages was worth the risk. Now here's the question that gets to the heart of everything. Why was medieval travel so dangerous? We've established that it was. But I want you to feel it. I want you to understand it from the inside. The first danger was the road itself. Medieval roads were not like modern roads. Many of them were built on top of old Roman roads, and the Romans had been gone for 500 years, taking their engineers with them. Nobody was paving these roads. Nobody was filling the holes. Nobody was clearing the fallen trees. After heavy rain, what had been a passable track in the morning could become a river of knee-deep mud by afternoon. In winter, frost would crack the surface and create hidden pools of ice that could snap a horse's leg in an instant. And in wooded areas, which covered a huge portion of medieval Europe, fallen trees could block the road completely, forcing travellers to find their way around, often losing the path entirely in the process. Travelling on foot, a person in reasonably good condition could cover perhaps 20 to 30 miles in a single day. On horseback, 30 to 40 miles. But that was on a good day. On a bad day, rain, mud, obstacles, wrong turns, you might make 10 miles, or 5, or none. The second danger was the night. And this is something we genuinely cannot imagine today. We live in a world of electric light. We forget what true darkness feels like. In medieval Europe, once the sun went down, the darkness was total. There were no street lights. There were no lit windows along the road. On a cloudy night without a torch, you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face, which meant travel after dark was essentially impossible unless you were very lucky, very desperate, or very foolish. Most travellers had to stop well before sunset to find shelter for the night, and finding shelter, that was its own entire adventure. An adventure we'll explore in detail later in this series, but the third danger, the one that kept medieval travellers up at night, the one they thought about before they left and prayed about every mile of the road, was other people. Specifically the people who were waiting on that road, for them. Banditry in medieval Europe was not a rare occurrence. It was a structured, persistent, and sometimes astonishingly organised part of the landscape. Road scholars like those who published in the Baltic Journal of Health and Physical Activity in 2021 have documented that banditry was a universal constant of medieval travel, from the forests of England to the mountain passes of the Alps, to the roads of Poland, where figures like the legendary outlaw known as Black Krzysztof, active between 1500 and 1512, terrorized travellers with such violence that he became infamous across the region. Pope Sixtus V had roughly 5,000 bandits executed in the 5 years before his death in 1590, and reportedly there were still 27,000 more at liberty across central Italy. Just in central Italy, 27,000 on the roads, waiting. Now here's something genuinely surprising. Most of these bandits were not strangers from far away. They were local. They were former farmers who'd lost their land, soldiers who'd come home from a war and found there was nothing left to come home to, younger sons of noble families who'd inherited nothing and needed to eat, people, in other words, who'd been failed by the system and had found a brutal way to survive outside it, which means that when a medieval traveller set out on a long journey, they weren't just navigating geography. They were navigating a social landscape of desperation, and the things they chose to carry and the things they chose to hide were a direct response to that landscape. Now I want to pause here and push back on something, because if I only told you the dangers, I would be giving you half the picture, and half the picture is a lie. Yes, medieval travel was dangerous. Yes, it required courage. But the remarkable thing, the thing that genuinely moves me every time I think about it, is that people went anyway. They went in their millions, year after year, century after century. They calculated the risks. They prepared as best they could. They said their prayers, they kissed their families goodbye, and they stepped onto the road. Because something trade, faith, duty, curiosity, love, desperation pulled them forward harder than fear pushed them back. There's something deeply recognizably human in that, isn't there? Here's one more thing I want you to hold on to as we move through this series. The items a medieval traveller carried were not random. Every single thing they chose to put in that bag, every piece of clothing, every tool, every scrap of food, every coin hidden in every secret pocket was the result of accumulated wisdom. Generations of hard-won knowledge about what kept you alive on the road, what kept you safe, what kept you fed, what made the difference between arriving and not arriving. In the coming parts of this series, we're going to open that bag, item by item, and every object we pull out is going to tell us a story not just about medieval technology or medieval culture, but about what it means to be human, about how people faced uncertainty, about what they were willing to risk for the things that mattered to them, about the extraordinary ingenuity hidden inside ordinary things. So here's where we are. We know the road was hard, we know the dangers were real, we know the travellers came from every corner of society, merchants and monks, pilgrims and students, soldiers and scholars. Now we need to walk into their world. And the very first thing we're going to pick up in the next part of our journey is something so simple, so humble, so easy to overlook that most people would walk right past it without a second glance. A stick. Just a wooden stick, leaning against the doorframe, waiting. But in the hands of a medieval traveller stepping out onto that open road, that simple stick was something else entirely. It was everything. So we left off with a stick, leaning quietly against the doorframe, waiting. And I know what you're thinking. A stick. Really? We're going to spend the next several minutes talking about a stick. But stay with me here, because this particular stick, this humble, unassuming piece of wood, might be the single most underestimated object in all of medieval history. And by the time we're done, I think you're going to look at it very differently. Let's begin with a scene. It's the year 1142. A man stands at the door of a church somewhere in the south of France. He's a dyer by trade, someone who spends his days working cloth and dye into colour's hands, permanently stained a modest life, a small world. But today is different. Today a priest is standing before him at the altar, and in the priest's hands is a wooden staff, taller than the man himself, made of ash wood with a small iron spike at the base and a carved hook near the top. The priest holds it up and blesses it, not the way you'd bless a meal or a house, with intention, with solemnity, with the full weight of the church behind the gesture, as if this staff were a sword being given to a knight before battle, which in a very real sense it was. Because this man is about to walk from southern France to Santiago de Compostela, in what is now northwestern Spain, roughly 1,400 miles, on foot, alone, and this stick. This stick is the only thing standing between him and everything the road might throw at him. The practice of blessing a pilgrim's staff before departure was not informal or optional. By the late 11th century it had become a formal ceremony of the church. The staff and the scrip, the small leather bag worn at the hip, were presented to the pilgrim from the altar in exactly the same way a knight's sword was blessed and presented before he rode to war. Think about that parallel for a moment. The sword and the staff. Two objects, two worlds, one for the man who fights with iron, one for the man who walks with wood, but both blessed by the same church, both treated as sacred tools for a sacred purpose, both carrying the weight of everything the journey ahead might cost. Now here's where it gets genuinely fascinating. The staff that a medieval pilgrim carried was not what we would picture today. It wasn't a short ergonomic trekking pole with a rubber grip and a wrist strap. It was tall, often taller than the person carrying it, typically somewhere between 5 and 6 feet in length, made from sturdy hardwoods, ash hazel or chestnut selected specifically for their combination of strength and flexibility. The Codex Calixtinus, a remarkable 12th century manuscript compiled around 1135 to 1140, considered the world's first travel guide of its kind, assembled likely by a French scholar and clergyman named Aymeric Pécourt, explicitly mentions and describes the pilgrim staff as an essential item of equipment. The Codex describes it in terms that go beyond the practical. The staff, it says, represents the two-legged nature of the pilgrim's journey, the journey of the body across the earth and the journey of the soul toward God. When a pilgrim walked with a staff in each hand, the text explains they moved like a three-legged creature, more stable, more grounded, less likely to fall. And on a medieval road, rocky, muddy, unpredictable, sometimes barely distinguishable from the surrounding countryside, stability wasn't a luxury. It was survival. But the physical design of the staff itself tells a story if you know how to read it. At the base, a metal ferrule, sometimes single, sometimes double-pronged. The archaeological evidence backs this up beautifully. At Worcester Cathedral in England, a 15th century burial was discovered a man identified as a pilgrim by the clothing he was buried in the cockle shell beside his body, and crucially the staff found with him. The staff was made of ash wood. It had a double-pronged iron spike at one end for grip on rocky and muddy surfaces, and at the other end traces of a horn tip. Here's the detail that stops me every time. The staff had been painted purple, not with any ordinary dye, with a pigment made by mixing bone black with a costly substance called kermes, a dye extracted from the bodies of female oak gall insects. Kermes was expensive, rare, not something a poor man spent money on frivolously, which tells us something important. This man cared about his staff. He adorned it. He gave it colour and beauty. This wasn't just a tool to him. It was a companion, an identity, a statement. Now here's the question that I find myself sitting with whenever I think about this. Why a purple staff? Why spend money on something so personal? Something no one was required to see on an object you were carrying through mud and rain across hundreds of miles? I think the answer is this. When you're about to walk 1,000 miles alone, you need something to hold on to. Not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. You need an object that belongs entirely to you, that reflects who you are, that you can look down at when the road gets hard and remember why you started. We don't talk about this side of medieval life very often. We talk about the danger and the hardship and the faith. But medieval people had inner lives just as rich and complicated as ours. They got lonely. They got scared. They doubted themselves. And sometimes I genuinely believe this. They gripped that staff a little harder, felt the smoothness of the wood under their hands and kept walking because of it. At the top of the staff that carved hook I mentioned. And this is where the staff becomes something more than a walking aid. That hook was a hanging point. From it a pilgrim might suspend a small water gourd, a canteen of leather or fired clay, a small purse with their coins, a rosary, sometimes a relic, a tiny fragment of bone or cloth from a holy site sealed in a small container and hung there to offer protection along the way. The staff, in other words, was also a carrying system, a portable anchor for the traveller's most essential possessions. Think of it as a medieval version of the feature we now take for granted on backpacks, that row of loops and clips along the shoulder straps, where you can hang a water bottle clip, a carabiner, attach whatever you need within arm's reach. Same principle, 800 years earlier, made of wood and iron. But here's what no one tells you, and this is the part of the story that genuinely surprised me when I first came across it. The staff wasn't just a tool and a symbol, it was a legal document. Let me explain. In medieval Europe, pilgrims occupied a unique and carefully defined position in society. Canon law, the law of the church, gave them specific protections that were embedded in the legal and social fabric of the time. Protections that included exemption from certain tolls along the road, the right to hospitality at monasteries and hospices, legal protection of their property back home while they were away, and crucially, protection of their person on the road. But here's the thing, none of these protections were automatic. You had to be identifiable as a pilgrim. You had to prove visually and immediately what you were before a tollkeeper decided to charge you, before a bandit decided you were worth robbing, before a local lord decided your presence on his land was suspicious. And the primary way you proved it, the primary visual signal that declared your identity to the world, was the staff, and the scrip, and the broad-brimmed hat. Together, this was what historians sometimes call the pilgrim's uniform, and it wasn't just clothing. It was a passport, a shield, a social contract. Research into medieval canon law, including scholarship published through academic institutions examining the development of legal protections for pilgrims from the 9th through 13th centuries, confirms that these protections against what was called fiscal abuse, specifically extra tolls, were well established in cultural assumptions about the special status of pilgrims. The staff was so thoroughly associated with the protected pilgrim that it appeared in heraldry on coats of arms, in ecclesiastical imagery in the arms of families who wanted to signal their history of pilgrimage. The Burden family, for instance, bore 3 pilgrim staves on their escutcheon, and the word itself, borden, was the French word for staff. To carry a blessed staff on the road of medieval Europe was not merely to have a walking aid, it was to wear a sign that said, "I am under the protection of God and the Church. Attack me at your peril." Now I want to be honest with you here, because I think this is where the reality gets complicated in a way that's worth acknowledging. Did the staff actually protect people? Did bandits see it and turn away? Did tollkeepers wave pilgrims through without charge because of a piece of wood? Sometimes, yes. The historical record contains genuine accounts of pilgrims being treated with remarkable generosity, fed, sheltered, guided by strangers who owed them nothing except the shared understanding that a pilgrim on the road was a sacred person doing a sacred thing. But sometimes no. The same historical record contains accounts of pilgrims being robbed, beaten, killed, of people who wore the pilgrim's uniform not out of genuine devotion, but as a disguise, a way to travel under a false identity, to cross borders without being questioned to gain hospitality they hadn't earned. The 14th century French poet Guillaume de Diguleville, who wrote a famous allegorical poem called The Pilgrimage of Human Life, imagined the pilgrim being handed both staff and scrip by a figure representing divine grace. The image was beautiful. The reality was messier, because the road didn't read intentions. It didn't care whether you were genuinely holy or genuinely desperate. It was just the road, long and dark and full of weather, and the staff in your hand was whatever it needed to be that day. There's one more dimension to this story that I find quietly remarkable. The staff was social. It announced you. It categorized you, but it also connected you. When medieval pilgrims arrived at a hospice or monastery at the end of a long day, they would sometimes lean their staffs against the outer wall, a cluster of tall wooden sticks standing together outside the door. A silent gathering, a community formed entirely by shared motion. Every staff worn differently, some plain and functional, some carved and decorated and personal, some with multiple objects hanging from the hook badges from previous shrines, small relics, tokens from people who had asked the pilgrim to pray for them at journey's end. And here's something beautiful that actually happened in Rome. Medieval pilgrims arriving at the holy city would leave their staff, their trusted companion, the thing they had leaned on for weeks or months across hundreds of miles at the church of San Giacomo Scossacavalli. They would leave it there, and then buy a new one. From the sellers named Vagari who kept their shops nearby, a new staff for the journey home. I've thought about this a lot, and what strikes me is the intimacy of that exchange. You walked all those miles with this piece of wood. It held your weight on the downhills. It steadied you in the river crossings. It was the last thing you touched at night, and the first thing you reached for in the morning, and then you set it down in a church doorway and walked away. Maybe it's a very human thing, the way we carry something through something hard and then let it go when we reach the other side. Maybe we all do this with something. I'll leave that thought with you. So that's the staff, that deceptively simple piece of wood that turned out to be all at once a third leg, a carrying system, a legal passport, a social identity, a spiritual companion, and an act of extraordinary personal faith. And yet for all the weight it carried, it weighed almost nothing, which is maybe the point. The most important things we take with us rarely take up much space. Now, if the staff was the first layer of a medieval traveller's protection, the thing the world could see, then the next layer is something the world was never meant to see at all. It covered the entire body. It weighed almost nothing, and in the right conditions it could mean the difference between waking up dry and alive or not waking up at all. Most people would call it clothing. But for a medieval traveller stepping out onto the open road, that cloak was something else entirely, something that makes our best modern outdoor gear look in certain ways like it's still catching up. Right. Let me ask you something before we go any further. If I told you that an object exists, something you can wrap around your entire body that keeps you warm in freezing temperatures, repels rain, without any synthetic coating, stays insulating, even when soaked through, works as a blanket, a tent substitute, a ground cloth, a carrying wrap and a windbreaker all at the same time, you'd probably assume I was describing something made in the last 20 years, some miracle of modern textile engineering, some collaboration between a German laboratory and an outdoor gear company with a sleek logo. But what I'm actually describing is a piece of medieval clothing, a wool cloak, and the more I learn about how it actually worked, the more I find myself genuinely humbled by the people who designed it, centuries before the word design meant what it means today. In the year 1936, a man was pulled out of a Swedish peat bog near the town of Varberg. He had been there for roughly 600 years, and he was still wearing his clothes. This is the Boxton Man. Dating to somewhere between 1350 and 1370, the mid-14th century, right in the heart of the period we've been exploring. His clothing survived in extraordinary condition because of the unique chemical properties of the bog water that preserved him, and what the archaeologists found when they carefully studied what he was wearing changed how historians understand medieval clothing in a fundamental way. He was dressed in layers, a linen undergarment closest to the skin, a woolen tunic over that, a hood, a separate piece fitted to his face with a long tail called a liripipe that could be wrapped around the neck for extra warmth, and over everything a cloak, semicircular in shape, made from dense fulled wool, pieced together from several panels of fabric because the looms of the 14th century were not wide enough to cut a garment of this size from a single cloth. Someone had sat and sewn those panels together. Someone had fitted the neck opening, carefully placed the fastening just off-centre at one shoulder. Someone had made this for this man, for this body, for this life on the road, and 600 years later we can still see it. That stops me every time. Now let me tell you what that cloak actually did. And I want to do this properly because I think most of us, myself, absolutely included before I started researching this, have a fundamentally wrong picture in our heads about medieval clothing. We think rough, itchy, heavy, wet, cold. The reality is considerably more sophisticated than that. Let's start with the wool itself. Medieval wool was not the hyper-processed, chemically treated lanolin-stripped fibre that ends up in most of today's cheap woolen products. Medieval wool was raw, or close to it, which means it retained something remarkable, its natural lanolin. Lanolin, sometimes called wool grease, or sheep's wax, is a fatty substance secreted by the skin of sheep. It coats each individual fibre of the fleece, and it is genuinely measurably water repellent. Here's the number that puts this in perspective. Wool can absorb up to 30% of its own weight in water before you even begin to feel damp against your skin. 30%. Think about the last time you wore a cotton shirt in the rain. Cotton once wet is immediately wet. It clings, it chills, it stays wet for hours. Wool, by contrast, manages moisture, actively absorbing it into the fibre structure, keeping it away from your skin, releasing it slowly as you continue to generate body heat. Medieval travellers didn't know the chemistry. They didn't know what lanolin was or why it worked. But they had centuries of lived experience telling them wool keeps you warm even when it's soaked. Wool keeps you alive when cotton would kill you, so they used wool, almost exclusively, for everything. Here's the other thing about wool that isn't obvious until someone tells you, and then you can't unknow it. Wool is naturally flame-resistant, not fireproof, but it will char and self-extinguish. rather than catching and burning the way synthetic fabrics do. For a medieval traveller sleeping next to an open fire at the end of a long day curled under their cloak, too exhausted to worry about the precise distance between themselves and the flames, this wasn't a marketing feature. It was the difference between waking up and not. Now, fabric alone doesn't explain the full intelligence of the cloak. The shape matters enormously. Most medieval travelling cloaks were semicircular exactly as we see on the Boxton man, and the semicircular shape wasn't arbitrary or decorative, it was engineered. When you wrap a semicircular piece of heavy wool around your body, the fabric naturally falls in overlapping layers at the front. Those overlapping layers create additional thickness exactly where the wind hits you hardest, the chest and torso. The curved hem at the bottom allows freedom of movement for the legs without the fabric tangling around the knees, the way a full-circle cloak might. And the fastening at one shoulder, not at the centre front, not with a modern zipper, but with a single brooch or pin at the shoulder, allowed the cloak to be adjusted, opened, dropped, or swung out of the way quickly, which matters enormously when you're walking 20 miles over rocky ground carrying everything you own. The last thing you need is to fight with your own clothing. But let me tell you the part that genuinely surprised me. The cloak wasn't just outerwear, it was shelter. When a medieval traveller had no inn to sleep in, which happened frequently as we discussed in part 1, they didn't have a tent. They didn't have a sleeping bag. They had their cloak. Wrapped around the body, it trapped the heat generated by 8 hours of walking. Spread on the ground, it served as a moisture barrier between the sleeper and the earth. Pulled over the head, it blocked wind. And the woolen fabric, because of its moisture-managing properties, kept the body warm even in damp conditions in ways that no other natural material available in medieval Europe could reliably match. The English antiquary and historian Ian Mortimer, in his extraordinary book The Time Traveller's Guide to Medieval England, published in 2008, describes travellers caught without shelter, simply pulling their cloaks tightly around themselves and sleeping under trees in hedgerows in the lee of stone walls, not comfortably, but alive, which on a medieval road in the middle of a November night was the goal. Now here's where class enters the story in a way that's impossible to ignore, because the cloak was not a single universal garment. It was a social document you wore on your back, and medieval society read it fluently. A poor traveller's cloak was undyed, raw wool barely processed coarse to the touch somewhere between grey and beige. Narrow because fabric was expensive, and you bought only as much as you absolutely needed. Knee-length at most, long fabric meant expensive fabric, and a peasant couldn't afford to drag 4 extra feet of wool through the mud just to look impressive. A comfortable merchant's cloak was heavier, better woven, maybe dyed in a modest colour, a russet brown, a muted green. Wider with more warmth and more presence. A noble's travelling cloak, and this is where it gets almost theatrical, could be lined with fur. Sable marten or otter pelts sewn inside the wool. According to historical analysis of medieval English prices and social customs, a sable-lined garment cost roughly 10 times more than a plain wool one. Marten and otter linings were approximately 30 times as expensive. 30 times. The difference between a labourer's cloak and a nobleman's cloak was not just comfort. It was a number that told everyone on the road exactly who they were dealing with. And on a medieval road where the wrong assumption about a traveller's status could result in anything from overcharging at an inn to a conversation with a very motivated set of bandits, what your cloak said about you was not a trivial matter. There's a detail from this period that I find quietly devastating. Undyed wool, the coarse grey-beige cloak of the poor traveller, was sometimes made deliberately from a fabric called russet. Russet was a rough, cheap wool cloth, and it had a meaning beyond its practicality. In medieval England, russet was associated with humility, with willingness to be seen as lowly. Penitential monks wore it, Some pilgrims chose it deliberately not because they couldn't afford better, but because wearing rough cloth was itself a form of the journey, a form of saying, I am stripping away comfort. I am walking in discomfort towards something that matters, which is, when you think about it, a remarkably sophisticated relationship with material culture. The cloak wasn't just keeping this person warm. It was making a statement about who they were choosing to be, on the road, in the rain, alone. Here's a question I genuinely want to sit with for a moment. We spend enormous amounts of money today on outdoor gear, Gore-Tex jackets, merino base layers, moisture-wicking everything, and I don't want to be glib about it. Modern materials are genuinely impressive and genuinely effective. But there's something worth acknowledging here. Medieval people arrived at a remarkably complete solution to the same problem we're still trying to solve. How do you stay warm and dry when the world outside is cold and wet and relentless? They answered it with sheep. With centuries of accumulated knowledge about how to process fibre and weave cloth, and cut a garment to work with the body's natural warmth rather than against it. They answered it without polyester, without chemical treatments, without a research and development budget. And honestly, when modern outdoor gear companies talk about wool as the original performance fibre, which they do with increasing frequency, they are not being poetic. They are admitting something true. One last piece of this story before we move on. The word cloak itself is fascinating. It comes from the Old North French word cloak, meaning a traveller's cape. Literally translated, it means a bell, because of the shape, the bell-like fall of heavy wool around the body. The word was used specifically for travel clothing, not for the ceremonial robes of the nobility, not for the decorative mantles of the court, for the cloak you wore when you were on the road, when you were moving, when you were between the safety of one place and the uncertain promise of the next. So every time a medieval traveller stepped out the door and swung that great piece of wool around their shoulders, they were in the most literal linguistic sense wearing a word that meant I am going somewhere. I find that beautiful. So the cloak covered the body, protected the body, signalled to the world who the body belonged to in the social order of things, and when necessary kept the body alive through the night. All from a piece of carefully woven sheep's wool cut in a half circle fastened at the shoulder with a single pin. But here's the thing. The cloak couldn't do everything. It couldn't carry the coins you needed to pay for that inn. It couldn't hold the food you needed to survive the miles between villages. It couldn't store the documents that proved you had the right to be where you were going. For all of that, for the actual cargo of a medieval life on the road, you needed something else entirely. A bag. But not just any bag. Because in the medieval world, the kind of bag you carried said just as much about you as the cloak on your back, and the difference between how a pilgrim packed and how a merchant packed was not just a matter of preference. It was two completely different philosophies about what it means to travel and what it means to need. There's a thought experiment I keep coming back to whenever I think about medieval travel. Imagine two people standing at the edge of the same road on the same autumn morning in 13th century France. Same road, same weather, same destination, the great trading city of Troy, roughly 3 days' walk ahead. The first person is a merchant. He's done this route 4 times before. He knows which inns are clean and which ones aren't. He knows which river crossing is impassable after heavy rain. He travels with a pack horse, and the pack horse is loaded until you genuinely wonder whether the animal has opinions about it. The second person is a pilgrim. She left her village 2 weeks ago. She's walking to the shrine at Chartres, which is another 4 days past Troy. She has a small leather bag at her hip. The bag is about the size of a modern laptop sleeve, and deliberately so. Same road, same physical world. 2 completely different theories about what it means to be alive and moving through it. And the thing that separates them, the thing that tells their whole story before they speak a single word, is what they're carrying. Let's start with the pilgrim's bag, because I think it's one of the most philosophically radical objects in all of medieval history, and almost nobody talks about it that way. The pilgrim's scrip, as it was called the word, comes down through Old French, and means roughly a small pouch or satchel was by design too small. That's not an accident. That's not a limitation. That's a statement. In medieval Latin, the scrip was called a capsella, a little container. And here is the detail that genuinely moves me every time I think about it. Capsella was also the exact same word used for a small reliquary chest, one of those ornate little containers that held fragments of holy relics, shards of bone or cloth, from saints' objects so sacred they were kept locked in precious metal boxes on cathedral altars. The capsella carried by a pilgrim on the road was linguistically the same object as the container holding a piece of the true cross. The connection was not lost on people at the time. The bag was a reliquary, the journey was sacred, and the traveller was in a very real sense a relic in motion, a living vessel of faith moving through the world. This is not poetry. This is medieval theology made portable. So what was actually inside this small, deliberate, philosophically loaded bag? Almost nothing. A bowl. Maybe wooden, maybe ceramic. Worn smooth from months of use. A spoon. Iron or bone. A knife, always a knife. We'll talk about that in detail soon. A small piece of cloth for washing. Perhaps a tiny book of prayers if the pilgrim could read and afford one. Coins a few. Enough for a toll or an emergency, not enough to attract the wrong kind of attention. And that was often it. The smallness was intentional for reasons that go beyond theology. The pilgrim's scrip was designed to communicate two things simultaneously. First, I am not worth robbing. There is nothing here. Move along. Second, I trust the world to feed me. And this second part is extraordinary when you stop to think about it. The medieval pilgrim carrying a bag too small for more than a day's worth of food was operating on the assumption, backed by law, by church decree, and by deeply embedded cultural obligation, that the world would provide. Monasteries were required to offer hospitality to pilgrims passing through. Hospices and pilgrim hospitals has been established along the major routes precisely for this purpose, spaced roughly a day's march apart. The historian Jonathan Sumption, in his landmark study of medieval pilgrimage, describes how itineraries were actually available to pilgrims, documents listing the rest stops, monasteries, pilgrim hospitals, places of interest and dangers along specific routes. Think about that. The medieval pilgrim didn't have a GPS, but they had something arguably more interesting, a network of human infrastructure built on religious obligation and social custom, designed specifically to catch them at the end of every long day. The small bag wasn't poverty. It was trust made physical. The willingness to walk into the unknown with almost nothing was itself a form of faith, not just in God, but in strangers. And I think there's something almost painfully beautiful about that. Now here's where it gets complicated. Because not everyone walking with a scrip was a genuine pilgrim. The pilgrim's identity, that small bag, the staff, the broad-brimmed hat, the cloak, was also by the 13th and 14th centuries a known disguise. People who needed to move across borders without being questioned. Debtors fleeing creditors. Fugitives putting distance between themselves and whatever they'd done. Even petty criminals who'd discovered that the pilgrim's uniform was a remarkably effective way to travel unmolested through regions where a stranger would normally be viewed with deep suspicion. Local priests in England had the power to impose pilgrimage as a legal punishment for minor crimes, which meant there were at any given time people on those roads walking as penance, not out of spiritual hunger, but because a court had told them to. The road didn't ask your reasons. The scrip didn't verify your sincerity. And this complexity, the coexistence of the genuinely devout and the genuinely opportunistic sharing the same road wearing the same uniform is part of what makes medieval travel so endlessly human. Now let's go to the other side of that road, the merchant and his pack. If the pilgrim's scrip was a philosophy of emptiness, the merchant's kit was a philosophy of preparation so thorough it could make your back ache just thinking about it. The great merchant travellers of the 13th and 14th centuries, the men and women who converged on the Champagne fairs in northeastern France, who crossed the Alps with caravans of pack mules to trade Flemish wool for Italian silk, who moved spices and leather and metals and wine across entire continents, these people travelled with everything. The Champagne fairs, those extraordinary events held 6 times a year in the towns of Troyes-Provins-Lagny and Bar-sur-Aube, each lasting up to 6 weeks, were among the most important commercial gatherings in medieval Europe. Flemish cloth meeting Italian silk, English wool meeting German metals, spices from the Levant changing hands in a market tent pitched in a French field. The merchants who attended these fairs didn't carry a scrip, they carried a system. A substantial merchant travelling to the Champagne fairs would organise his goods in layers of increasing security. The bulk cargo bolts of cloth barrels of wine chests of raw materials was loaded onto pack horses or pack mules. Pack horses were the workhorses of medieval commerce. Most were galloways, small stocky animals bred originally in Scotland, selected specifically for their sure-footedness on rough ground, and their ability to carry heavy loads across difficult terrain without complaint. Historical records from 13th century England describe pack-horse routes across the Pennines, carrying salt limestone coal fleeces and finished cloth between Lancashire and Yorkshire. In some areas, roughly 1,000 pack horses a day were passing through the same river crossing. 1,000 animals every day, just at one ford. The scale of medieval commercial transport was genuinely staggering, and it's almost completely invisible to modern imagination because it left so few traces. But here's what interests me most about the merchant's pack, and where I think the real contrast with the pilgrim becomes vivid and sharp. The merchant's saddlebag wasn't just a larger version of the pilgrim's scrip. It was partitioned, organised, specifically designed for the different categories of things a merchant needed to keep separate. Coins in one compartment, heavy, valuable, and best kept, where you could feel their weight constantly. Documents in another, contracts, letters of credit, records of debts owed and debts to collect. Scales and weights in another still, because every serious merchant travelled with their own measuring equipment, since trusting local weights and measures was a gamble you couldn't always afford to take. And the really important documents, the letters of introduction, the royal safe conducts, the bills of exchange that allowed you to transfer large sums of money without actually carrying the coins, these went somewhere safer still, sewn into the lining of a coat, tucked inside a boot, hidden in a false bottom of a chest. Because the medieval road did not distinguish between honest and dishonest travellers. It simply presented opportunities, and a merchant who carried 500 silver pennies in an obvious purse was a merchant who deserved by the ruthless pragmatism of the road to lose them. I want to pause here on something that I think is genuinely underappreciated in how we talk about medieval economics. The bill of exchange that document the merchant carried instead of coins was not just a financial instrument, it was a revolution. The Champagne fairs were, among many other things, the incubators of one of the most consequential financial innovations in Western history, the formalization of credit and debt across long distances. A merchant from Genoa attending a fair in Troyes didn't need to carry a chest of silver coins from Italy across the Alps. He could draw up a bill of exchange and order to his representative in France to pay a specified sum on a specified date and use that paper instead of metal. The bill circulated. It was honoured. It was accepted by parties who'd never met its issuer in cities they'd never visited, in currencies they had to convert. This was the ancestor of the check, the letter of credit, the wire transfer. Born on the road, born in a leather saddlebag, born out of the very practical problem that carrying heavy coins through bandit-infested mountain passes was an excellent way to arrive at your destination significantly lighter than you'd planned. Let me tell you something that I think brings these two worlds, the pilgrim and the merchant, into sharpest focus. They often shared the same road, literally. The great pilgrimage routes and the great trade routes of medieval Europe overlapped to a remarkable degree. The Via Francigena, the road that ran from Canterbury through France and over the Alps to Rome, was simultaneously a pilgrim road and a merchant highway. The same road that merchants used to carry Flemish cloth to the Italian markets was the road that pilgrims walked to their shrines. The same hospice at the end of the same day's march sheltered both, the pilgrim with the tiny scrip trusting the world to provide, the merchant with the organised saddlebag trusting nothing except what he'd prepared for. Both hungry, both tired, both watching the same sunset from the same inn courtyard, and maybe over a bowl of barley pottage and a shared fire recognising something in each other. The pilgrim's radical trust, the merchant's radical preparation, two different answers to the same terrifying question. What do you take with you when everything could go wrong? Here's what I take from this personally. I think most of us spend our lives somewhere between these two philosophies. We pack too much for some journeys and not enough for others. We sometimes trust when we should prepare, and prepare when we should trust. The medieval traveller, whether pilgrim or merchant, had to commit. The weight of the bag on your shoulder was a declaration of intent. A small bag said, "I am relying on grace." A heavy bag said, "I am relying on myself." And both of those postures, as it turned out, were sometimes enough, and sometimes they weren't. Because on the medieval road, the one thing neither bag could really protect you from was what you encountered the moment you left it at the inn and stepped back out into the open air. Specifically, and this is where things get genuinely interesting, the object that every single person on that road carried. Not in a bag, not on a horse, but on their belt. Always within reach, always within a single motion. Something so ordinary, so universal, so completely present in every medieval life that historians tend to gloss right over it, and yet without it the medieval journey simply could not have happened at all. Picture this. You're 3 days out of the last village. The road ahead bends into a stretch of dense forest. Your boots are damp. Your legs ache in the particular way that only comes from walking on uneven ground since before the sun was fully up, and you are quite profoundly hungry. This is the moment the medieval traveller had been preparing for since before they ever left home. Not the walking, not the weather, not even the bandits, the food problem. Because in a world without refrigeration, without tin cans, without the ability to stop at a roadside stall and buy a warm meal on demand, feeding yourself across days or weeks of continuous travel, was in its own quiet way one of the most technically sophisticated challenges of medieval life. And the solutions that medieval travellers developed to meet that challenge are, I think, genuinely extraordinary. Not because they were elegant, some of them were deeply unpleasant, but because they worked. Let me start with the object at the absolute centre of every medieval traveller's food kit: bread. But not the bread you're thinking of. Not soft, not warm, not fragrant from a bakehouse oven. The bread of the road was a specific intentional object baked twice, sometimes 3 times, until every last trace of moisture had been driven out of it. The result was something that looked like a tile, felt like a rock, and tasted by most accounts like eating compressed flour dust. But it lasted for weeks without spoiling, months if kept dry. In later centuries, this category of bread would be called hardtack, a word coined by sailors in the 19th century. But medieval travellers, soldiers and pilgrims were eating the same basic object centuries earlier, calling it by different names in different languages, all of which amounted to roughly the same thing: the bread that does not die. The principle behind it is simple and genuinely elegant. Bacteria and mould need moisture to survive. Remove the moisture completely, bake it out, drive it out, leave nothing behind, and you create something that spoils so slowly it might as well be immortal. The cost of that immortality, of course, was that you could not eat it dry. Try to bite into twice-baked road bread without soaking it first, and you would quite seriously risk cracking a tooth. Medieval travellers knew this well. They soaked it in broth, in ale, in water, in anything wet that was available. They let it absorb. They waited. And then they ate something that was by the standards of what your body actually needs. After walking 20 miles on a cold morning, perfectly functional, deeply unfestive, but functional. Now bread provided the bulk of the calories, but calories alone do not keep a body moving for weeks across difficult terrain. For protein, for the fat that keeps you warm when you're sleeping under a cloak in October, travellers relied almost entirely on preserved meat and preserved fish. And preserved in the medieval context meant primarily one thing: salt, industrial quantities of it. Salt pork, thin layers of pork stacked alternately with layers of salt, then submerged in heavily salted brine, was the great protein staple of the medieval road. It lasted, it travelled, it provided calories. It also tasted, after sufficient time cured in its container, something like an object that had been licked by the ocean and then forgotten in a dark room. The saltiness was not incidental. It was the entire mechanism. Salt draws moisture from meat and creates an environment so hostile to bacterial growth that the pork could remain technically edible for months. There was also stockfish cod that had been split down the middle, fixed to a pole, and left to dry in cold wind, particularly in Scandinavian conditions, where the air itself acted as a natural preservative. Wikipedia's entry on medieval cuisine notes that preparing stockfish was time-consuming and involved beating the dried fish with a mallet before soaking it in water, which gives you some sense of what the eating experience was like. The historian Christopher Dyer, in his landmark work, Standards of Living in the Later Middle Ages, documents that salted herring was among the most widely traded food commodities in Northern Europe, precisely because it travelled so well and lasted so long. Kippers made from North Sea herring were found in markets as far away as Constantinople. Let that sink in for a moment. A fish caught off the English coast, salted and dried, carried overland by merchants and travellers, appearing on a table in what is now Istanbul. Food preservation was not just survival technology. It was the infrastructure of medieval commerce itself. But here is the practical problem that the medieval traveller faced every single day on the road. And I think this is a detail historians sometimes gloss over too quickly. The caloric math was brutal. A person walking 20 to 25 miles a day on uneven ground, carrying a pack in weather that ranged from cold to freezing for much of the year, burned somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 calories daily. Possibly more, and the food they were carrying hard: bread, salt, meat, dried fish. A wedge of hard cheese had to supply those calories in a form compact enough not to slow them down, shelf-stable enough not to poison them, and simple enough to prepare over a small roadside fire with minimal equipment. Hard cheese was one of the genuinely brilliant travel foods of the medieval world, high in fat and protein, shelf-stable for weeks. If the rind stayed intact, it carried more calories per unit of weight than almost any other portable food available. And yet medieval medical theory, which organized foods according to their heating, cooling, moistening and drying properties, classified hard-aged cheese as difficult for the stomach to process in large quantities. Medieval physicians solemnly advised travellers to eat cheese in moderation. Medieval travellers who were burning 4,000 calories a day on difficult roads sometimes did not listen. I find this quietly hilarious. 600 years ago, people were already ignoring their doctor's dietary advice for exactly the same reasons we do today. They were tired, hungry, and the cheese was right there. Now I want to talk about the drink question, because this is where things get genuinely interesting, and where a very famous piece of historical common knowledge turns out to be considerably more complicated than it's usually presented. You've probably heard that medieval people never drank water. The claim goes water was too dangerous, so everyone drank ale all day, even children, because the fermentation process made it safe. This is an oversimplification, a significant one. Historical records from 13th century London, including the expense accounts of St. Paul's Cathedral document workers, being provided with both water and ale on different working days depending on what was available. Martin Cornell, a beer historian who has written extensively on this subject, points out that the claim, "people drank beer instead of water because water wasn't safe," is in his words simply wrong as a blanket statement. People did drink water. They drank it from springs, from clear running streams, from wells that weren't downstream of anything alarming. What they avoided, because they could observe the consequences even without understanding the biology, was water from rivers that passed through towns, water from wells near burial grounds, water from sources that smelled wrong or looked discoloured. They could not name bacteria. They had no concept of germ theory, but they had generations of accumulated observation that certain water in certain places made you very sick very quickly. So on the road where you had no control over what was upstream of the stream you were about to drink from, the pragmatic choice was often small ale, a low-alcohol fermented grain drink far weaker than modern beer, closer to 2% alcohol at most, brewed in enormous quantities across medieval England and France. The St. Paul's Cathedral records from the late 13th century note an allowance of 1 gallon of this small ale per working person per day. 1 full gallon. This was not celebration drinking. This was hydration strategy. The ale was effectively a liquid bread providing calories fluid and enough fermentation to reduce the risk of the microbial hazards that plagued raw water sources. Travellers carried it in leather flasks, sealed wooden containers, clay jugs wrapped in cloth. And when they ran out, because 3 days from the last village you eventually run out of everything, they looked at the available water, made their best judgment and drank. Here's a question I want to ask you directly because I think it reveals something real. If you had to walk 20 miles tomorrow, carrying everything you needed to eat for 3 days with no shops, no refrigeration, and no certainty about the water sources along the route, what would you bring? Most modern people, when they genuinely think about this question, arrive at something surprisingly close to what medieval travellers actually packed. Something that doesn't spoil, something dense in calories, something that doesn't require cooking if fire isn't available. Nuts, hard cheese, dried meat, dense bread. These weren't primitive choices. They were the result of centuries of accumulated trial and error, generations of travellers learning often at considerable personal cost exactly what would and wouldn't sustain you when the road stretched further than expected, and the next village was still a day's walk away. There was one more item that the experienced traveller learned to carry, and it sits at an interesting intersection of food medicine and pure practicality. Spices. Not as a luxury, though they were certainly expensive, as a preservation tool. Pepper in sufficient quantities is a genuine antimicrobial agent. Medieval cooks knew empirically that heavily peppered sausage lasted longer than unseasoned meat. The history professor Constance Bouchard, in her writing on medieval daily life notes, that the medieval autumn pig harvest followed a predictable ritual: eat as much fresh pork as possible immediately after slaughter, then salt and smoke the rest. And if you had access to enough pepper, use that too. This is why spices were worth fortunes in the medieval world. Not because medieval people wanted to mask the taste of rotten meat. That old myth has been thoroughly debunked by food historians. Rotten meat in the medieval world was identified, recognized, and avoided just as it is today. People then were not more tolerant of food poisoning than we are now. Spices were valuable because they extended the life of food that was otherwise genuinely difficult to preserve. They were in the most literal sense technology, and a medieval traveller who could afford a small pouch of pepper or a twist of dried ginger in their pack was carrying something with both practical and considerable financial significance. I want to give you one final image before we move on. Imagine an inn courtyard at the end of a long road day in 14th century England. Half a dozen travellers arrive within an hour of each other as the light drops. A pilgrim with an almost empty scrip. A cloth merchant with a pack horse loaded with unsold goods. A young student walking from one cathedral school to another. They all sit down at the same long table inside. The inn serves pottage, that thick, endlessly variable medieval staple of grain boiled with whatever vegetables, scraps of meat or legumes the kitchen had to hand that day. Sometimes it tasted of leeks and barley, sometimes of cabbage and dried peas, sometimes of something less identifiable but not entirely unwelcome after 8 hours on a wet road. They pull out their own bread, their own knives, because in the medieval world you always brought your own knife. Inns did not supply them. They eat together, these strangers from different lives bound temporarily by the same road, the same hunger, the same relief at a fire and a bowl of something warm. It occurs to me sitting with this image that the food of the road was never really just about nutrition. It was about the human need to carry enough of home with you to survive being far from it. The salt pork in the bag, the hard bread at the bottom, the small flask of ale. These were practical objects, but they were also in their way comfort. And on that note of comfort, let's talk about the one object that made that inn meal possible. The one thing every single traveller brought to the table. Not the food, not the bowl, the knife. The small iron blade at the hip that every medieval person, man, woman, merchant, pilgrim, student, wanderer never left home without. The object that cut the bread, carved the salt pork, served as a tool and a weapon and a symbol all at once. Because the story of that knife and what it meant to carry it on the medieval road is, I promise you, considerably more interesting than you might expect. Something I've been thinking about for a while now, ever since I started going deep into this topic, is the question of what exactly made a medieval traveller legitimate, not safe. We've already talked about how dangerous the road could be, not comfortable. The food alone should have settled that question. But legitimate. What made the difference between a traveller who was welcomed at a gate, waved through a toll, offered a bed in a monastery guest house, and trusted with a commercial transaction, versus someone who was viewed with deep suspicion, turned away, possibly detained? The answer was not the sword on your hip. It was not the size of your horse. It was not even necessarily how you spoke or how you dressed. It was paper, or more precisely parchment, and wax, and a small, unremarkable ring that most people wore on their finger without ever fully appreciating what it meant. Let's start with the documents, because the document system of medieval Europe is one of the most underappreciated and, frankly, astonishing administrative achievements of the period. By the late 12th century, well before anyone had invented the printing press, before there was anything like a national postal service, before the idea of a standardized passport had even been imagined, the English crown was already routinely issuing what were called letters of safe conduct. In 1157, King Henry II granted a formal letter of safe conduct and protection to the merchants of Cologne travelling in London, declaring them to be treated as his own people and friends. Think about what this means. A merchant from Cologne, a foreigner, a stranger, someone who couldn't prove their identity by pointing to a known family or a recognisable face could walk into a hostile city, produce a piece of parchment bearing a royal seal, and be treated as though the King of England personally vouched for him. Not because the city guard knew this merchant, not because the merchant had connections in London, but because of a document, a piece of carefully worded Latin on prepared skin authenticated by melted wax. This was in every meaningful sense a passport, and the system was far more extensive and sophisticated than most people realise. These letters of safe conduct, sometimes called a gadaticum in medieval Latin, a sauf conduit in French, were genuinely valuable objects, valuable enough to be carefully stored, carried in waterproof pouches, handled as gently as possible across weeks of rough road travel, and for good reason. Because breaking the promise contained in a safe conduct was not merely a social embarrassment. In England, a parliamentary act of 1414 during the reign of King Henry V made it an act of high treason to violate a royal letter of safe conduct. High treason, the same category of crime as attempting to overthrow the monarchy. Attacking someone who carried a legitimate safe conduct was, in the eyes of the law, an attack on the king himself. This tells you something important about how seriously the medieval world took the document as a technology of trust. Now here's where it gets interesting for the ordinary traveller, the merchant, the pilgrim, the student who wasn't important enough to obtain a royal letter. They had their own parallel system. A pilgrim who wanted to travel with any kind of protection was expected before departing to visit their local priest, to make confession, and to receive a letter stating in the simple but powerful language of medieval ecclesiastical Latin that this person was a genuine pilgrim travelling in good faith, requesting safe passage exemption from tolls at certain points and hospitality at monasteries and pilgrim hospices along the route. The letter named the destination. It named the bearer. It requested in the name of the church that whoever read it treat this traveller with the charity due to any person on sacred business. This was not a guarantee, but it was better than nothing. And on a road where you might encounter a dozen toll collectors, 2 or 3 river crossings with fees, and at least one suspicious local lord who wanted to know exactly who was crossing his land, and why better than nothing was often the difference between reaching your destination and not. But of all the documents carried by medieval travellers, the one that fascinates me most is not the most impressive-looking one. It's not the royal letter with its dangling wax seal and formal Latin phrasing. It's something much smaller. It's the merchant's mark. A merchant's mark was a personal symbol, a distinctive, often geometric design created by an individual trader that functioned simultaneously as a signature, a logo, a brand identity, and a legal claim of ownership, all at once. The historian Sylvia Thrupp, in her landmark study, The Merchant Class of Medieval London, covering the period from 1300 to 1500 documents, how these marks were used to identify bales of wool bolts of cloth and casks of goods, travelling on ships in caravans and across dozens of hands between the point of production and the point of sale. Because a medieval merchant travelling to the Champagne fairs or sending goods on a ship from England to a buyer in Flanders faced a very specific and very practical problem. Their goods might travel on 3 different ships, change hands at 2 different ports, be handled by a dozen different agents, and arrive at a destination weeks or months after leaving the source. If a ship sank and ships did sink, the cargo still legally belonged to the merchant who owned it, but only if it could be identified. The merchant's mark on the bale was the medieval equivalent of a shipping label combined with a deed of ownership. Unmistakable, impossible to misattribute. registered with the Merchants' Guild so that any dispute about ownership could be resolved by reference to the official record. It was, as one historian of medieval graffiti put it so perfectly, the logo of the Middle Ages, and crucially this is the detail that stops me every time it worked equally well for literate and illiterate people. A dock worker in Bruges who couldn't read a single Latin word could still identify the symbol on a bale and know exactly which merchant it belonged to. In a world where perhaps 10 to 20% of the population could read with any fluency, the visual symbol was a more democratic form of identity than any written document could ever be. Now the merchant's mark could appear in several places, on the goods themselves stamped or branded directly, in the merchant's ledger and correspondence used as a personal signature, and most importantly for our purposes on the merchant's personal seal. This is where the story of medieval identity becomes genuinely beautiful. The University of Nottingham's archive of medieval documents states it plainly seals were the only form of personal authentication in the Middle Ages. Deeds were not usually signed in the modern sense until the 16th century. Let that sink in. For most of the medieval period, your handwritten name meant almost nothing as legal authentication. What mattered was your seal. The impression left in beeswax mixed with turpentine and coloured red with vermilion for formal documents. By pressing your personal signet ring into the soft surface before it hardened. A signet ring. Let's take a moment with this object because I think it deserves far more attention than it usually receives in the story of medieval travel. By the late 13th century, and the historical records are quite specific about this, it wasn't only kings and bishops who had personal seals. All levels of European society, from wealthy merchants down to modest craftspeople, were using seals for both business and personal correspondence. A merchant's signet bore their personal mark. A knight's bore their heraldic device. A wealthy widow's might show a standing female figure holding a bird of prey, as one surviving English example from around 1275 depicts. Even a woman who had almost no independent legal standing could possess her own seal, her own authenticated identity, her own mark on the world. The ring itself was usually small and practical iron or bronze, for those of modest means silver or gold, for the wealthy sometimes set with an engraved gemstone of agate or carnelian, the design cut in intaglio below the surface, so it would leave a raised impression in wax. When its owner died, the ring was typically destroyed, not because it was valueless, because it was too valuable in the wrong hands. Forging the royal Great Seal was a capital crime in medieval England. Forging a private seal to impersonate someone could bring consequences nearly as severe. The seal was your identity in a way that was almost biological in its intimacy. It bore your mark. It authenticated your word. It stood in for your physical presence across distances you could never personally cross. When you sent a letter closed with your seal, you were in a very real sense travelling inside that document. Now I want to ask you something directly. Think about what you carry today to prove who you are. A driver's license, a passport, a bank card with your name on it, a phone with your face locked to its screen. How much of your daily life, crossing a border, accessing your money, signing a contract, receiving a package, depends entirely on a system of verified identity that you didn't personally create and mostly don't think about? The medieval traveller had to think about it. Every single day on the road was a conscious calculation about identity and legitimacy. Who are you? Who vouches for you? What documents do you carry? What mark can you produce? The letter of safe conduct, the pilgrim's recommendation from a priest, the merchant's mark on the bale, the signet ring on the finger. These were not bureaucratic formalities invented by people who enjoyed paperwork. They were the difference between being trusted and being turned away, between being helped and being harmed, between arriving and not arriving at all. There is a moment from 1357 that I keep returning to. The Treaty of Berwick had just ended more than 2 decades of bitter hostility between England and Scotland. With the two kingdoms newly at peace, the English administration began issuing formal safe conducts to Scottish travellers wishing to cross through English territory. The first of these, issued on the 13th of August of that same year, went to a man named John Barber, the Archdeacon of Aberdeen, who was travelling south to Oxford to study. A Scottish clergyman crossing into the territory of his country's former enemy to pursue an education at one of the great universities of Europe. He made it. Because of a piece of parchment with a seal. There is something in that story, the thin, fragile connection between a man's desire for knowledge and a blob of red wax on a piece of prepared skin, that I find genuinely moving. The document didn't change the road. It didn't remove the danger. It didn't transform human nature, but it changed what was possible. So the invisible armour of the medieval traveller was assembled layer by layer from these interlocking systems. A letter, if they were fortunate enough to obtain one requesting safe passage from whoever held power over the territory ahead. A seal, or mark, their personal authenticated identity worn on their finger, or stamped on their goods saying, "I am a real person with real rights and real accountability." And money, because all of this, the documents, the seals, the letters of protection, worked considerably better when accompanied by the ability to pay tolls, purchase provisions, and demonstrate that your presence on this road was economically legitimate as well as legally so. The coins in a medieval traveller's purse were not just currency. They were part of the argument. Part of the case you made at every gate and every toll and every suspicious innkeeper that you were worth welcoming rather than worth robbing. And yet even the most perfectly documented traveller carrying the finest royal letter and a purse full of silver pennies could not prepare for what the road could do to a human body. Not the bandits, not the weather, not the questionable salt pork, the quiet, invisible enemies, the ones with no army, no face, and no interest whatsoever in your letters of safe conduct. Fever, infection, a wound that wouldn't close. What the medieval traveller carried against those enemies, the herbs, the dried roots, the small sacred objects, the prayers half whispered over a flame, was one of the strangest and most deeply human chapters in this entire story. And it's exactly where we're going right now. Picture this. You've been walking for 11 days. Your feet have developed blisters the size of coins, and 2 of them have gone soft in the middle, in the way that tells you something is going wrong underneath the skin. Your lower back aches with a dull, persistent throb. 3 nights ago, you slept on wet ground when the roof of a barn where you'd taken shelter leaked badly, and since then you've had a cough that won't quite leave. You're 3 weeks from your destination. There is no doctor within 30 miles. Even if there were, you couldn't afford one. What do? This is the practical reality that every medieval traveller faced the moment their body started to fail them on the road, and it happened to all of them sooner or later. The question was never whether something would go wrong. It was whether you had thought carefully enough before you left about what to carry when it did. And what they carried is one of the most fascinating, surprising, and genuinely moving chapters in the whole story of medieval travel. Let me tell you about a man named Adam of Cremona. In approximately 1227 or 1228 Adam, a physician sat down and wrote what historians now consider the very first dedicated travel medicine guide in the Western world. He composed it for the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, who was preparing to lead a crusade to the Holy Land. The title translated from Latin is essentially about the regimen and way of the journey for the traveller. Think about what it means that someone thought to write this book. It means the dangers of travel to human health were so well understood, so consistently experienced, and so specific enough to require a dedicated guide written by a professional physician for one of the most powerful men in Europe just to get through a long journey in reasonable condition. Adam's guide covered everything. Diet, stay as close as possible to your home foods, he advised, because sudden changes in diet upset the humoral balance of the body. Pace regulate your walking speed carefully, especially on unfamiliar and rough roads, because overexertion on a new terrain was a reliable path to injury. Sleep adequate rest was not a luxury but a medical necessity. And water. Adam gave very specific instructions on how to assess and, when necessary, desalinate water, because contaminated water was among the most reliable killers on any long road. He also addressed leeches, not as a horror story, as a serious tool. He warned travellers to distinguish carefully between good leeches described as round and shiny, and bad leeches, which appeared black or blue in colour and were typically found near fetid or stagnant water. Good leeches were a legitimate medical instrument. Bad leeches could make you significantly more ill. I find this genuinely remarkable, not because it's strange, but because it shows us something we tend to miss about medieval medicine. It was not primitive guesswork. It was a systematic, carefully observed, experience-based discipline doing its best with the knowledge available. Getting some things badly wrong, yes, but getting a surprising number of things quietly right. The traveller's medicine kit, the actual physical collection of things a careful person on a long road would carry, existed at a fascinating intersection of three very different systems of knowledge. The first was herbal medicine. Practical botanical accumulated over centuries of careful observation and far more scientifically grounded than most people assume. Yarrow, a common field weed that grows along roadsides, was used to stop bleeding and treat wounds. Medieval healers had noticed something real here. Yarrow does have genuine astringent and mild antimicrobial properties. It was called soldier's herb because it was carried specifically for battlefield wounds. Plantain, not the banana, but the broad-leafed weed that grows in almost every path and meadow in Europe, was applied fresh to cuts, bites, and skin inflammation. Adam of Cremona's contemporaries would have recognized it as one of the most reliable and accessible wound plants available. A traveller who knew their botany could, if disaster struck, find their medicine growing right at the side of the road they were walking on. Honey, ancient, universal, genuinely antibacterial in ways that medieval healers couldn't fully explain but had absolutely observed, was used both internally and as a topical treatment for wounds. Medieval recipe books recommend applying honey directly to infected areas, sealing out air and drawing out the corruption. We now know honey's low water activity and hydrogen peroxide content make it genuinely hostile to bacteria. They didn't know the mechanism, but they knew it worked, and they were right. Then there was theriac. Theriac was the prestige medicine of the medieval world, the compound remedy that every serious traveller tried to acquire before a long journey, and that wealthy ones absolutely would not leave without. It was expensive. It was complicated to prepare, requiring dozens of ingredients combined according to precise formulas. And it was considered a near-universal antidote effective against poison, snake bites, plague, and a range of illnesses that shared no obvious common cause. The key ingredient, and the one that still stops me when I think about it, was snake flesh. The logic was ancient, the idea that the thing which can cause harm is also the thing that can cure it. Theriac had originally been developed as an antidote specifically to snake venom, with the snake itself incorporated into the preparation as part of the treatment. Adam of Cremona's guide notes that travellers heading to the Holy Land carried theriac specifically because of the poisonous serpents known to inhabit the region. It would be ingested or smeared directly on a bite wound. Does it work? Almost certainly not for actual venom, but theriac contained so many other active ingredients, including ginger opium poppy in small quantities, and various genuinely bioactive plants, that for travellers suffering from fever or digestive illness, it probably provided some real benefit, alongside the considerable psychological comfort of having the most powerful medicine money could buy in the bottom of your bag. The historian Christian Nockels Fabry, writing in Early Science and Medicine, describes theriac as a costly panacea imported from Italy. Its production was centred in Venice and Bologna, where civic authorities would stage elaborate public ceremonies to certify the preparation's authenticity, because the market for fake theriac was apparently substantial enough to require official government oversight. A drug so valuable that cities held public festivals to prove it wasn't counterfeit. That tells you something about how desperately people wanted to believe in the protection it offered. Now here is where I want to ask you something. If you had to walk for 3 months across territory, where you might encounter contaminated water, poisonous animals, infected wounds, sudden fever, and the bone-deep exhaustion of carrying your life on your back through all kinds of weather, and where your only medical options were plants, compounds, and prayer, would you not reach for anything that offered even the possibility of protection? I think I would. And this is the point where we arrive at the second layer of the medieval traveller's medical kit, the one that makes historians smile and modern people uncomfortable in equal measure: the charms. A manuscript from around the late 14th century held at Cambridge and studied by medical historians preserves a charm known as the 3 good brothers. The text describes 3 good brothers walking a road and meeting Christ, who asks where they are going. They answer that they are going to the Mount of Olives to gather healing herbs. The charm then invokes the wound of Christ, described as a wound that never rotted, never festered, never bled, and never made any dropping, and calls for the wound being treated to heal in the same manner. The scribe very helpfully marked it in the margin with the single word charm. Not prayer, not remedy, charm. The people who used these texts knew what they were. They knew the difference between a medical recipe and a charm, and they used both, often written down side by side in the same personal handbook, a remedy using plantain on one page, a charm invoking the wounds of Christ on the facing page, without any apparent sense that this was contradictory. This is the thing about medieval medicine that modern people keep misunderstanding. They didn't choose between the rational and the supernatural, they layered them. Because when you are 3 weeks from home with an infected foot and no antibiotics, you use every tool available to you. You apply honey, you speak the words, you make the sign of the cross, and then you hope with everything you have that the combination of herb and prayer and ritual is enough. I actually find this quite moving, not laughable, moving, because that impulse to reach for every possible form of protection, when the body you live in starts to fail you, is not primitive. It is profoundly recognizably human. The third layer was the one that travelled on the body itself rather than in the bag, the pilgrim badge. We talked in an earlier part about what the pilgrim's scrip and staff meant as identity markers on the road, but the badges, those small flat mass-produced objects of lead alloy or pewter, carried a specific medical logic that went far beyond social signalling. When a pilgrim arrived at a great shrine, they didn't just look at the relics. They pressed their badge against the reliquary, or as close to it as the shrine keepers would allow. The idea was that this physical contact transferred something of the saint's power, what theologians called virtue, directly into the metal object. The badge became what scholars call a secondary relic, not the saint's body itself, but something charged with the same protective and healing energy. This was not a fringe belief. It was official, documented, widely understood practice. The London Museum holds over 1,000 medieval pilgrim badges. Fordham University's scholars note that these objects were understood to function in a similar manner as a secondary relic, which was brushed against the relic or reliquary in order to absorb the essence of the saint. The most popular shrines sold over 100,000 badges a year, In 1520, the church at Regensburg sold over 120,000 in a single year, after a shortage the previous year had created enormous pent-up demand. 120,000 people buying physical protection they could pin to their hat or wear against their skin. A badge from Canterbury's shrine of Thomas Becket showed the jewelled reliquary containing a fragment of his skull. A badge from Santiago de Compostela, the scallop shell, signified one of the longest and most demanding pilgrimages in medieval Europe. History Today notes that for someone in England or northern France, a badge from Compostela or Jerusalem was the medieval equivalent of wearing a souvenir from Everest or Antarctica. It told the world at a glance I went there, I survived it, and I brought something back. Here's a detail that I've been sitting with for a while because I think it cuts to the heart of what the medieval traveller's medical kit actually was. The pilgrim badge was worn on the outside, on the hat, on the cloak, visible to everyone except the wearer themselves. You couldn't see your own badge without taking it off and looking at it, but everyone you walked toward on the road could see it immediately, which means it wasn't just protection for the body, it was a message to the world. I have made this journey. I carry the protection of this saint. I am not alone on this road. There is something in that the outward-facing nature of the medieval traveller's most personal protection that I think says something true about how these people understood their own vulnerability. They didn't pretend they were invincible. They advertised their reliance on forces greater than themselves, right there on their hat for every stranger to see. I'm not entirely sure modern people are better at that. And now, having packed our bag with herbs and honey and theriac and charms and a small lead badge still warm from being pressed against a saint's reliquary, we face one final problem. We don't know where we're going. Not really. There are no maps available to us. Not maps in any form we would recognize. No roads marked with distances. No signs pointing to the next town. No compass rose orienting us in the darkness before dawn, when we need to leave early and the path ahead forks in two directions, and both of them disappear into the same grey mist. How did medieval travellers find their way across a continent? The answer is stranger, more human, and considerably more ingenious than you might expect, and it starts right now. Right now, at this exact moment, if I asked you to get from where you are to a city 200 miles away that you'd never visited before, you would pick up your phone and be looking at a step-by-step route within about 4 seconds. You would not think about it. You would not plan it. You would not ask anyone. The whole problem would dissolve before it had fully formed. Now take away the phone. Take away every road sign, every distance marker, every painted line on any road surface anywhere. Take away all the maps, not just the digital ones, but every piece of paper with a route drawn on it. Put yourself on a dirt road at dawn at the edge of a forest at a junction where 3 paths split off in 3 different directions, none of them marked, and you have no idea which one leads to where you're going. You have to be somewhere specific in 12 days. What do you do? This is the question that every single person who travelled in the medieval world faced every day for as long as they were on the road. And the answer, the actual system that functioned across Europe for hundreds of years and got millions of people where they needed to go, is one of the most fascinating and underappreciated achievements in the entire history of human movement. Let me start with what medieval maps actually were, because there is a very common misconception here that I want to address before we go any further. Maps existed in the Middle Ages, but they were not for travellers. The great Mappa Mundi, the large world maps produced by medieval scholars like the famous Hereford Mappa Mundi from around 1300, placed Jerusalem at the centre of the known world, surrounded by the continents of Europe, Asia and Africa, with paradise shown at the top. They were breathtaking objects, genuinely beautiful, theologically sophisticated, and an impressive achievement of the scholarly imagination. But you could not use one to find your way from Paris to Rheims. They were not to scale. They were not oriented consistently. They were designed to explain the theological and cosmological structure of the world, not to help a person navigate through it. They belonged in a monastery library or a cathedral treasury, not in a traveller's bag. Even the Guff map, the most practically detailed map of England that survives from the medieval period, produced around 1360, and remarkable for the accuracy with which it shows the road network and the distances between towns, was too large and too stiff for road use. It was made for a great household or a royal office, not for the road itself. So the medieval traveller carried something different. They carried knowledge. The primary navigation technology of the medieval world was the itinerary, not a map, a list. An itinerary was a written sequence of places and distances, essentially a set of step-by-step directions, encoded as a list of waypoints expressed in days of travel rather than miles. From London to St Albans one day on horseback, from St Albans to Dunstable, from Dunstable to Towcester, from Towcester to Daventry, and so on stage by stage across the entire journey, each leg measured in time rather than absolute distance, because time was what a traveller could actually predict. The distance between two towns was variable, depending on the road condition, the weather, whether you were on foot or horseback, and whether you had to stop early because of darkness or illness. But the sequence of places was fixed. If you reached the right place each night, you knew you were on the right road. The most extraordinary surviving example of this system is the itinerary produced by the monk Matthew Paris around 1250 as part of his great Chronica Majora, a history of the world from creation to his own time. Matthew Paris drew in a strip format designed to be read like a vertical scroll the complete route from London to Jerusalem, town by town, stage by stage, each stopping point illustrated with a small drawing of the town's most distinctive feature, the cathedral, the gate, the bridge, so that a traveller who couldn't read at all could still follow the route by recognising the pictures. London, St Albans, Dover, Calais, Rheims, Vercelli, Rome, Brindisi, the coast, the sea, Acre, Jerusalem. The whole journey compressed into a series of illustrated stages structured like a comic strip, which Wikipedia notes with the delight that I share was an achievement unprecedented elsewhere in the medieval world. Think about what Matthew Paris understood that we've since forgotten. He knew that a traveller's mind does not work with abstract geography. It works with sequence, with landmarks, with the answer to a single question, what comes next. Now, itineraries were useful, extraordinarily useful for travellers who could read and who had the good fortune to own or borrow a written copy. But most medieval people could not read, and even those who could rarely owned their own documents. So how did the majority of travellers navigate, they asked. This is the part of medieval navigation that I find most quietly remarkable. Oral direction giving was a sophisticated community, maintained constantly updated technology. Every village, every crossroads, every river ford had people who knew exactly which road led where, what the conditions were, like how long it would take and what dangers lay along that specific route at that specific time of year. A well-informed Londoner in the 14th century might direct a traveller like this go out through Aldersgate, cross Smithfield north toward Islington, then Barnet. Ask again at Barnet for the road to St Albans. At St Albans ask for Towcester. Each leg of the journey was a separate conversation. Each conversation updated your understanding. A beautiful example of this survives in a medieval text. When ye come to a bridge, go thereover. Ye shall find a little way on the left hand. From thence ye have but 4 miles unto your lodging. That's not so different from what someone might tell you today, standing in a parking lot pointing in a general direction. The medium has changed, the method hasn't. But oral directions had limits, and the medieval traveller knew this, 2 limits in particular. The first was language. Medieval Europe was not linguistically unified. A traveller moving from England into France, then into the Italian states, was moving through several entirely different languages in the space of a few weeks. Latin survived as a common language of the educated and the clerical, which is partly why knowing Latin was genuinely useful for travel, but it was not universally spoken. The second limit was that asking someone for directions required there to be someone to ask. On a road through a forest that stretched for 20 miles without a settlement, or in an alpine pass in early November, before the snows had fully set in, or crossing a stretch of moorland in fog, there was no one to ask. For these situations, the medieval traveller relied on the landscape itself. Rivers were the most reliable navigational feature in all of Europe. Rivers flowed toward the sea. Rivers connected towns and markets and crossings. Rivers had names that locals knew and could give you. Following a river was almost never wrong, even if it added distance to your journey, because a river guaranteed you would eventually reach human habitation. Church towers were the second great landmark. In a mostly flat landscape without forests, the spire of a parish church could be seen for several miles. And because the church was almost always at the centre of a settlement, a tower in the distance meant shelter, food information and rest at the end of a day's walking. The medieval traveller learned to read the landscape the way we read signs. A well-worn track over a hill meant the shortest route had already been discovered. A path that bent east toward lower ground was probably heading for a ford. The direction of moss on stones, the behaviour of birds at dusk, the slope of the land toward a distant valley, where morning mist gathered all of it, was navigational information legible to anyone who had spent years reading it. Here's something the Codex Calixtinus understood very well, that extraordinary 12th century pilgrim's guide to the route to Santiago de Compostela that I mentioned briefly in an earlier section. The 5th volume of this codex, compiled around 1170, was essentially the first great travel guide in Western history. It described 4 distinct routes through France to Santiago, each with specific towns, specific distances and specific warnings. And the warnings are where it becomes genuinely fascinating. One passage describing the stretch of road through Bordeaux reads, "Guard your face carefully from the enormous insects which the locals call by their own names. And if you do not watch your feet carefully, you will slip rapidly up to your knees in the quicksand." This is not theology. This is a practical warning from someone who had actually walked this road and wanted the next person to know about the insects and the quicksand near Bordeaux. Elsewhere, the guide includes an extraordinary moment of editorial fury about the river ferrymen at the border of Gascony, who were apparently charging exorbitant tolls, 1 coin per person, 4 for a horse for crossing a river that the guide describes as quite narrow. The author's solution recorded in the text for every subsequent traveller: they should be eternally damned for their avarice, which is, if not actually helpful for navigation purposes, at least satisfying to read. The Codex Calixtinus also described which waters were safe to drink and which were not, which towns offered good hospitality, and which peoples along the route were considered hospitable or dangerous. It was a guidebook in every sense we recognize, a living repository of accumulated experience written down and passed forward, so that the next person who walked that road would not have to discover everything through their own suffering. Let me ask you something. When you think about medieval navigation, about finding your way across Europe without maps, without signs, without anything, does it seem impossibly hard? Or does it seem now that you know about itineraries and oral directions and rivers and church towers and the detailed human knowledge encoded in guides like the Codex Calixtinus, Does it seem actually like a reasonably well-engineered system? I've been sitting with this question for a while, because I think we have a habit of measuring medieval achievements against modern technology and finding them wanting. And that comparison is, to put it gently, somewhat unfair. The medieval navigation system was not as fast as Google Maps. It was not as accurate. It could fail in specific circumstances, in unfamiliar territory, in bad weather, when language was a barrier. But it was robust in ways that we don't always appreciate. It was maintained by millions of people simultaneously, all updating it through their own experience. It stored information not on servers but in communities. And it was in its quiet way extraordinary because it got millions of people across a continent over a period of several centuries to places they had never been before, without a single road sign. What strikes me most, though, about medieval navigation is not the practical ingenuity of the system. It's the social contract that underlies it. The whole thing depended on people telling strangers the truth. When a traveller stopped at a village and asked which road led to the next town, the direction they received needed to be accurate. Not out of legal obligation, not out of any enforcement mechanism, simply because the community understood that travellers needed accurate information, and providing it was a form of the basic hospitality that made the whole system of long-distance movement possible. That's a form of trust that doesn't show up on any map, and it ran silently beneath the entire medieval road network from England to Jerusalem for hundreds of years. There was one more layer of the navigation system that we haven't talked about yet, and it's the layer that surprises people most: each other. Travellers in the Middle Ages almost never walked alone for the full length of a long journey. They clustered into groups for safety, yes, as we discussed early in this series, but also because other travellers were your most current and reliable source of navigational information. Someone coming toward you on the road from the direction you were heading had just done the leg of the journey you were about to attempt. They knew which river was flooded, which bridge had collapsed, which town had a market on and would be crowded, and where the best inn was. That exchange of information at a crossroads or a hostel between a traveller going east and a traveller going west was a living update to the navigation system. No infrastructure required, no authority maintaining it, just two people on a road sharing what they knew because they both understood that this was how the world worked. So, we now have our traveller properly equipped, medically prepared, documented and sealed with an itinerary in hand, and a head full of landmarks, and a trusted understanding of which rivers flow which way. There is one thing left to arrange, the most fundamental thing of all: somewhere to sleep. And this is the chapter of the medieval road that surprises people most, because the system of inns, monasteries, and pilgrim hospices that existed across medieval Europe was far more sophisticated, far more structured, and far more human than anything the popular image of the Middle Ages tends to allow. It was in the truest sense an underground network of hospitality running quietly beneath the official world, maintained by monks and merchants and anonymous innkeepers, and connecting every corner of the continent. The door to that network is right in front of us. Let's walk through it. There is a sentence written in Latin sometime in the 6th century that has never stopped echoing through history. It appears in chapter 53 of the Rule of St. Benedict, the foundational document of Benedictine monasticism, the set of guidelines that shaped how monks lived, worked, prayed, and organized their communities across medieval Europe for nearly 1,000 years. The sentence translated reads, "All guests who present themselves are to be welcomed as Christ. Not some guests, not wealthy guests, not guests who arrive with the right documents or the right clothing or the right religious credentials. All guests." 7 words of Latin that created across a continent and across several centuries the most extensive hospitality network the medieval world ever built. Before we talk about where travellers slept, we need to understand something about the medieval concept of hospitality that is genuinely different from how we think about it today. In the modern world, hospitality is largely a commercial transaction. You need a room. I have a room, we agree on a price, you get the room. Clean and simple. In medieval Europe, particularly in its earlier centuries, hospitality carried a much heavier freight than that. To welcome a traveller was in the theological understanding of the time an act of direct religious merit. The stranger at your gate might be poor, might be dirty, might be exhausted and speaking a language you didn't fully understand, but they might also be Christ. You couldn't know, and so you treated them accordingly. This was not metaphor for the medieval mind. It was a genuine possibility that had to be taken seriously. The obligation it created was absolute, and that theological obligation embedded in the Benedictine rule, reinforced by centuries of preaching and charitable practice, built something extraordinary. Let me take you to the year 990. Sigeric the Serious, that was actually his nickname and I find it endearing, was the Archbishop of Canterbury. He had just travelled to Rome to receive his pallium from Pope John XV. The pallium was a white woolen stole marked with 6 black crosses worn around the neck as the Archbishop's seal of office. Every new Archbishop of Canterbury had to make this journey personally to collect it. There was no other way. The road was approximately 2,000 kilometres each way. From Canterbury across southern England to Dover across the Channel, to France, through Reims and Lausanne, across the Alps, through what is now the Great St. Bernard Pass, through Tuscany, and into Rome. On his return journey in 990, Sigeric did something that accidentally transformed medieval European travel. He asked his secretary to write down every stopping point. 79 stages, 79 overnight stops, each one carefully recorded in Latin, in a document that still survives today in the British Library. This 2-page list, one of the most consequential travel documents in the history of Europe, became the foundation of what we now call the Via Francigena, the road from France to Rome. By the Jubilee year of 1300, the Via Francigena was receiving an estimated 2 million pilgrims annually. Every one of those 2 million people needed to sleep somewhere at the end of each of those 79 stages. And the system that fed, sheltered and moved those 2 million people was built almost entirely on the hospitality obligation that Benedict had written into his rule 6 centuries earlier. The monastery guest house was the first tier of this system. Every monastery operating under the Benedictine rule was required to maintain a dedicated space for travellers separate from the monks' own quarters, heated unlike most of the monastery, and provided with food and clean water. The scholar Julie Kerr, in her study of Benedictine hospitality in England, between approximately 1070 and 1250 documents, how seriously major houses took this obligation. The Cistercian monastery at Kirkstall near Leeds had a completely separate guest house, with its own kitchen and remarkably piped water. Guest quarters in Cistercian houses had fires unlike the monastery itself, where heat was strictly rationed and provided only in a warming room for elderly and infirm monks. So the guest was in a very literal physical sense better accommodated than the monks themselves. There was a cost to this generosity, a significant one. The Cluniac Priory at Bermondsey, just off the road between London and Dover, one of the busiest travel corridors in medieval England, nearly bankrupted itself through the demands of hospitality. Too many travellers, too consistent a flow, too many free meals and free beds and fodder for horses. Reading Abbey had the same problem. So many guests arrived that the abbey went into debt. The eventual solution was pragmatic and slightly heartbreaking. Rich guests continued to be welcomed freely. Poorer travellers were turned away to a separate hospice built outside the abbey gates. Even charity had to balance its books. Now the monastery guest house worked extraordinarily well for travellers who arrived at the right time, who knew where the monasteries were, and who could communicate their basic needs ideally in Latin, which remained the common language of the educated and the clerical throughout the medieval period. As early as the 9th century, as the Via Francigena was being travelled by pilgrims from across northern Europe, practical phrase books appeared, basic vocabulary guides in the languages of the territories a pilgrim would pass through. A German speaker making the journey to Rome needed to know how to ask for water in French, how to request directions in Italian, how to signal that they were a pilgrim, not a threat. These were in their quiet way the first travel phrase books in European history. But beyond the monastery guest house, especially as trade grew, as towns expanded, and as the population of the road increased dramatically, through the 12th and 13th centuries a second tier of the system developed: the commercial inn. The emergence of the commercial inn in medieval Europe is one of those developments that seems in retrospect completely inevitable. But it took a surprisingly long time to arrive, and when it did, it changed the landscape of travel completely. Until around the 11th century, a traveller on the road had essentially three options: a monastery guest house, the hospitality of a private household or sleeping outdoors. The commercial inn, a business specifically dedicated to housing and feeding travellers for payment, was genuinely new. And when it arrived, it was more sophisticated than most people expect. A proper medieval inn of the 13th or 14th century in a town of any size along a major route was not a simple room above a tavern. Historical research shows that by 1379, most of the inns that were still operating in England around 1600 were already in existence. They'd been doing business for over 2 centuries. The structure was consistent: a main hall for eating and socializing, sleeping chambers, ranging from 5 to 17 in number, with 1 to 3 beds each, a kitchen, stables for horses, and storage space for goods. That last item, stable and storage, was the critical commercial innovation. An alehouse might give you a place to sleep. Only an inn gave your horse a safe place to spend the night. Only an inn gave the merchant a secure place to leave their goods. For anyone travelling with animals or cargo, which was most of the serious long-distance traffic, this was not optional. It was the entire reason the inn existed. The historian John Hare's research on Winchester College and its investments in the medieval inn trade shows that innkeepers were among the wealthiest people in their communities. They served on local councils, acted as banking agents, and ran parallel commercial businesses in brewing, wine, importing, and cloth trading. The inn was not just a place to sleep, it was a marketplace, a warehouse, an informal bank, a centre of commercial intelligence where a merchant could learn in one evening what trade conditions were like over the next 100 miles. One English innkeeper between 1455 and 1470, a man named Richard Kingsmill, served simultaneously as Royal Constable Town Bailiff Justice of the Peace and Member of Parliament. A man who ran a place where people slept and ate was in the medieval world a person of genuine consequence. The inn was also immortalised in the most vivid and lasting way possible by Geoffrey Chaucer. The Tabard Inn in Southwark, the hostelry from which Chaucer's pilgrims depart at the beginning of the Canterbury Tales in the 1380s, was a real place. It had been built originally by the Abbot of Hyde specifically so that he and his fellow monks had somewhere to stay when their business brought them to London. The innkeeper is Harry Bailey. He is cheerful, practical, entrepreneurial. He mediates disputes. He organises the storytelling contest that gives rise to the tales themselves. He is, in other words, exactly what a good innkeeper needed to be, because the inn was where every class of medieval society met, ate at the same table, and slept under the same roof. The nobleman and the merchant and the pilgrim and the student all temporarily equal in their shared need for a bed and a hot meal. Chaucer understood this. The inn as a social leveller, the road as the great equaliser. Let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed when you travel somewhere new how much you depend on the people you encounter along the way? The person at the desk who tells you which cafe is actually worth going to. the local on the train who mentions that the road you plan to take is closed today. The small piece of human knowledge offered without obligation that saves you hours of confusion. Medieval travellers depended on exactly this at every stage of every journey, and the network of inns, monasteries, hospices, and private households that served them was maintained by that same impulse, the impulse to help the person in front of you. Whether because God required it, or because you ran a business and needed them to come back, or simply because you knew what it was like to be tired and far from home, there is one more layer of this hospitality network that I want to spend a moment with. Because beyond the monastery and the commercial inn there was something quieter, something that doesn't appear in official records or architectural surveys. The ordinary household. In a period before inns were common, and in areas where they remained scarce, even after commercial hospitality developed, ordinary people along the road opened their doors. A farmer whose house sat on a well-travelled path might regularly have travellers sleep in the outbuilding. A widow in a village might supplement her income by offering a bed and a meal to passing merchants. A family with a corner of a loft to spare might take in a pilgrim for the night for the price of a conversation, and perhaps a small coin. This layer of hospitality is almost entirely invisible to the historian because it was informal, undocumented, and considered too ordinary to record, but it was everywhere, running like an underground stream beneath the more visible institutions. It is why the medieval road, for all its genuine danger, all its discomfort, all the things we've talked about in this series, was ultimately survivable, not because of any single institution or any single rule, but because millions of ordinary people over hundreds of years understood that the stranger at the door needed help, and helped. Now, we have followed our traveller from the moment they stepped out of their front door through every layer of what they carried and how they survived the road. And there is one question left. What did they bring back? Not just the physical objects. The pilgrim badges, yes. The merchant's samples, the letters, the acquired goods. But the other things, the stranger stories, the words in foreign languages that stuck in the mind, the habit of seeing the world as larger than the village you came from. The medieval world invented something on those roads that we still haven't fully recognized. It invented tourism. It invented the idea that traveling to see something, to experience something, was worth doing for its own sake. And what travelers carried home from the road in those small worn bags and tired bodies was more world-changing than anything else we have discussed. That final part of the story begins right now. Think about the last time you came back from a trip. Not the big dramatic homecoming, not the airport or the train station, just the quiet moment the night you returned when you sat down, set your bag on the floor and started taking things out. A small gift for someone, a receipt you kept for no real reason, a local item you found in a market that you couldn't quite justify but bought anyway. Maybe a photograph on your phone of something that caught your eye and that you haven't looked at since. We do this instinctively. We carry things home, not because we need them, but because the journey changes something in us, and we want to hold a piece of it in our hands. Medieval travellers did exactly the same thing, and the objects they carried home, the way they displayed them, the stories they told about them, the new eyes with which they looked at their own village, after returning from a journey of hundreds of miles, changed Europe in ways that took centuries to fully become visible. Let's start with the souvenir, because the medieval souvenir is one of those historical subjects that seems at first glance a little trivial, and then you pull at the thread, and suddenly you're holding half the story of medieval visual culture. The pilgrim badge is the most famous of these objects. Small flat, usually cast in lead alloy or pewter, cheap enough to be affordable by a common traveller, distinctive enough to be immediately recognizable to anyone who saw it. Santiago de Compostela had the scallop shell, Jerusalem had the cross, Canterbury had the head of Thomas Becket shown in the form of the jewel-encrusted reliquary that housed a fragment of his skull. Amiens had John the Baptist's head on a plate, which, if you think about it for a moment, is quite an image to put on a small metal badge that you pin to your hat. Between the 12th and the 16th centuries, these badges were sold in their thousands at famous destinations across Europe: Jerusalem, Santiago, Rome, Canterbury, and hundreds of smaller local shrines. The most popular sites were selling more than 100,000 badges a year. In 1466, Aachen sold 130,000 badges during a single feast day season. 130,000 in a single event from a single city in the 15th century. Let the number sit for a moment. That is mass production. That is a souvenir economy of genuine scale. These were, as historians have rightly noted, the first mass-produced tourist souvenirs in European history, and the London Museum today holds more than 1,000 of them just from excavations in and around London alone. Tens of thousands have been found across Europe since the mid-19th century, predominantly pulled from riverbeds, which is a mystery and a poetry unto itself that I'll come back to. The badge was not just decoration. This is the thing that makes medieval souvenirs genuinely different from a modern fridge magnet, and I think it's worth pausing on. When a pilgrim bought a badge at Santiago de Compostela and pinned it to their hat, they were not simply advertising that they had been somewhere. They were claiming that the badge itself carried a residual sanctity from the holy site. It had been there. It had been pressed against the reliquary or touched to the stone of the shrine, or simply purchased in the city where the saint's bones lay. The proximity to holiness was considered transferable. The object absorbed something. This is why ampalae, the small lead or pewter flasks sold alongside badges, were filled with holy water or oil, blessed at the shrine, or in the most prestigious cases water that had been mixed with a tiny trace of dust from the actual relic. Pilgrims wore these vials on strings around their necks. They brought them home and used the contents to bless fields, livestock, sick family members' newborns. Archaeological research by William Anderson, published in the journal Medieval Archaeology, suggests that in England many ampullae were deliberately broken open in fields. After their owner returned home, their contents released into the soil. They have been found predominantly in ploughed land, often cracked or damaged in ways that suggest intentional opening. The water from Canterbury Cathedral, or the dust of a saint's bones at Santiago de Compostela, mixed into the earth of a farmer's field in Norfolk or Normandy. There is something genuinely moving about that. The journey did not end at the front door. It extended outward into the land. But objects were not the only thing travellers carried home. They carried stories. And stories in the medieval world travelled farther and lasted longer than any lead badge. One of the most extraordinary examples of what a returning traveller could carry in their mind and what they might eventually do with it is the case of Marjorie Kempe. Marjorie Kempe was born around 1373 in Bishop's Lynn, Norfolk, the daughter of a merchant and mayor. She married at 20, had 14 children, and then in her early 40s began one of the most extraordinary series of journeys any medieval English person undertook. She went to Jerusalem, she went to Rome, she walked the Camino to Santiago de Compostela. She travelled to northern European cities, including Gdansk, Aachen, and Stralsund. She did all of this as a woman largely without male escort in an era when this was both dangerous and theologically suspect, and when she came back having begged her way home after giving away her money to the poor in Rome, having been abandoned by her travelling companions multiple times, having been arrested for heresy in Leicester on her way back from Spain, and acquitted having seen Mount Calvary and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre with her own eyes, she dictated her life story to a scribe. What emerged is the Book of Marjorie Kempe, completed around 1436 and widely considered the first autobiography written in the English language. Not a saint's life written by a cleric, not a chronicle written by a monk. A woman's account of her own experience, her fears, her visions, her arguments, her joy, her chronic tendency to burst into loud weeping in the middle of churches, which her fellow pilgrims found deeply trying. The manuscript was lost for centuries. A 7-page pamphlet of extracts was printed in 1501 by Wynkyn de Worde, and then the complete text vanished from view until 1934, when a Colonel Butler Bowden was looking for ping-pong balls in a cupboard at his family's country house, and found instead a bundle of papers that turned out to be one of the most important literary discoveries of the 20th century. The full manuscript, now British Library Additional Manuscript 61823, was published in 1936 and has never been out of print since. What made Marjorie's journey possible at all was the network of roads, inns, hospices, monasteries, fellow travellers, and accumulated navigational knowledge that we have spent the last several parts of this series exploring. She moved through it alone and formidable, and brought back a book. Let me ask you something that I find genuinely puzzling. When historians talk about the birth of travel writing, about the first stirrings of a genuine curiosity about the wider world, as something worth experiencing, not just crossing, not just surviving, but actually experiencing, they almost always start the clock much later. With the Renaissance, with the Grand Tour, with the 18th century. But something was happening much earlier. Count Eberhard of Württemberg, when asked about his pilgrimage to Jerusalem in the late 15th century, replied that there were 3 things in life that could neither be recommended nor discouraged: marriage, war, and a voyage to the Holy Land. Because all 3, he said, might begin very well and end very badly. That is not the voice of a person who travelled only out of obligation. That is the voice of a person who understood the journey as transformative, as something that changed you irrevocably, whether you wanted it to or not. The Book of John Mandeville, a fantastical, partly fabricated, magnificently entertaining account of travels to the Holy Land, Egypt, Persia, India and beyond, written somewhere around 1357, survives in more than 300 manuscripts, and was translated into 10 languages. 300 manuscripts. In an age before printing, when every single copy had to be written by hand. That is not a text that survived because people had to read it. That is a text that survived because people wanted to read it. Because people were hungry for it. Because the idea of far places even half invented, far places, even places described with the somewhat free relationship to accuracy that Mandeville maintained, fed something in the medieval reader that nothing closer to home could satisfy. Medieval Europe was not insular. It was curious, deeply voraciously curious about the world beyond what it could see from its own walls. Now back to the badges in the river, because this detail has stayed with me, and I want to offer you my own reading of it. Tens of thousands of medieval pilgrim badges have been pulled from European rivers, particularly from the Thames in London, the Seine in Paris, and the rivers of the Low Countries, predominantly from the mud of old riverbeds and waterfront deposits. The standard interpretation is that pilgrims threw their badges into the water as offerings, following an ancient tradition of depositing precious objects in rivers as acts of devotion. That may be entirely correct. And yet, I find myself imagining a different story. A traveller returning home after 6 months on the road. They have walked from London to Santiago de Compostela and back something like 2,000 miles in total. They have crossed the Alps in October. They have been robbed outside of Pamplona and recovered. They have made friends they will never see again. They have seen things, the sea, the mountains, the city of Rome, the bones of the apostle, that they will never have words adequate to describe to their neighbours. And they stand on London Bridge, coming home at last, and they hold this small lead badge in their hand, and they throw it into the Thames, not as an offering to the river, as a gesture of completion, as a way of saying I carried this as far as I needed to. I don't need to hold it anymore. The journey is in me now, not in the metal. I cannot prove this reading. History does not give us access to the private interior of individual medieval minds. But when I look at those thousands of badges in the riverbed, that is what I see. People letting go. Here is what I believe the medieval road actually produced in the end across those 3 or 4 centuries of mass pilgrimage and long-distance trade. It produced a slow, quiet revolution in how European people understood the relationship between their own small world and the larger one beyond it. Before mass travel, most people's understanding of distance was almost entirely abstract. They knew the world was larger than their village, but they had no felt sense of it. No embodied knowledge of what it took to walk 200 miles or to cross a mountain pass in November, or to hear a language spoken that shared no word with your own. After returning from a journey of any real length you knew, you had stood in a foreign city and felt yourself to be foreign. You'd sat in an inn where no one spoke your language and managed through gesture and patience and the small number of words you had memorized from a phrase book to ask for water and a bed, and you'd come home changed, not dramatically, not in a way you could necessarily explain, but you saw your own village differently. You had a sense now of its proportion, of how small it was against the continent you had crossed, and also paradoxically of how precious it was. Because you had been gone and you had come back and the face of someone who loved you was waiting at the gate. That experience, that particular combination of enlargement and homecoming, is what we mean when we say someone has travelled. Not merely moved, travelled. And medieval people, millions of them, were doing exactly that. Travelling. In the full sense of the word. They invented it. Not as a concept people had moved across landscapes since the beginning of human history, but as a practice that changed the traveller that was understood to change the traveller that was undertaken precisely because it would change the traveller. The medieval road built the inner geography of Europe as surely as it built the outer one. We've come a long way. From the moment we set out in part 1 with a single traveller standing at the edge of the road in the 14th century, wondering if the journey was worth the risk, we have followed every thread of what that journey actually required. The staff they leaned on, the cloak that kept them alive, the knife on their hip, the badge on their hat, the sealed document in their bag, the knowledge of which river led where the stranger who told them the truth at a crossroads, the monastery that opened its gate after dark and the small lead souvenir thrown from a bridge into a river that swallowed it without ceremony, keeping it for us to find 800 years later. There is one more thing I want to talk about, because there is a part of the medieval traveller's story that we have circled around but haven't yet addressed directly. They lived in a world that thought violence was sometimes not just permissible, but necessary. And the question of what weapons you were allowed to carry, who could bear arms under what circumstances with what legal and social consequences, was not a minor footnote to the journey. It was for many travellers the question that determined whether they arrived at all. That story comes next. Let me describe a scene. It is sometime in the summer of 1329, 1 year after the Statute of Northampton has been signed into law by King Edward III of England. A merchant from Norwich is riding south toward London on the main road alone with a small pack of goods across his horse. Strapped to his belt is a short sword, not decorative, not particularly expensive, but sharp enough. He has worn it on every journey for 15 years. At a crossroads outside of Cambridge, he is stopped by a justice's deputy. The sword is noticed. A heated conversation follows. The merchant argues that the road is dangerous. He's been robbed twice in his career. He has every right to defend himself. The deputy cites the new statute. No man, great or small, is to go or ride armed in fairs markets or no part elsewhere, unless he is the king's servant authorized to keep the peace. The merchant's sword is confiscated. He continues to London unarmed on a road where he knows perfectly well that bandits operate. This tension between the right to protect yourself and the state's interest in controlling who carries what is one of the most philosophically rich arguments in the history of medieval law, and it played out in real and practical terms on every major road in England and across much of continental Europe for the entire period we have been discussing. I want to be transparent with you about something. This topic is genuinely contested among historians and legal scholars. The Statute of Northampton, one of the central medieval weapons laws that still echoes in legal debates today, has been interpreted in radically different ways. Some scholars read it as a broad prohibition on public carry of edged weapons. Others argue it only targeted threatening behaviour, riding in force, wearing full military armour, intimidating the king's officials. Who was right depends in part on what you think the law was actually for. And to understand that, you need to understand what medieval Europe thought violence was. The medieval world had a surprisingly sophisticated and surprisingly contested theory of violence. Violence was not simply good or evil. It was good or evil depending entirely on who committed it against whom, for what reason, and under whose authority. The Church worked through this problem for centuries. St. Augustine in the 5th century had laid the groundwork with his theory of the just war, that force applied to defend the innocent to restore peace, and under legitimate authority was not merely permissible, but in some circumstances morally required. Thomas Aquinas refined this in the 13th century, codifying the conditions under which armed force was acceptable, and explicitly connecting the right to use it to the duty of protecting those who could not protect themselves. The Peace of God movement, beginning at the Council of Charroux in 989, spreading rapidly across southern France, and eventually all of Europe, took this theology into practical law. Councils of bishops declared that knights were forbidden from attacking non-combatants, clergywomen, peasants, merchants, pilgrims. These were people who by definition could not fight back. Attacking them was not honourable violence, it was predation. The Truce of God extended this further, forbidding armed conflict on holy days and during sacred seasons, Lent, Advent, the feast days of saints, of which there were at various periods as many as 168 per year. Nearly half the calendar off limits for legitimate violence. Think about that. Nearly half the year during which the Church declared violence even between knights, who were entitled to fight each other, morally impermissible. Whether people actually obeyed this is another question. But the framework itself is extraordinary. A civilization that was simultaneously deeply militarized and deeply concerned with constructing formal moral limits on when violence could legitimately occur. What does all of this mean for the merchant on the road, the pilgrim with her staff, the student walking from Paris to Bologna? It means their position in the violence question was genuinely complex. They were not knights. They were not soldiers. They were not in the chivalric framework entitled to carry a sword. The sword was a class marker as much as a weapon, an object that announced, "I am a man of sufficient rank to have the right to use force." The elaborate ceremony of knighting, with its vigil over arms, its ritual bath, its blessing of the blade, all of it was designed to consecrate the violence of a particular class of person and separate it from everyone else. When a common merchant buckled on a short sword, he was making a claim that cut against this framework. And yet, in 1389, Geoffrey Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales, and no one in the 14th century would have thought twice about the fact that several of Chaucer's pilgrims are described as carrying weapons. The miller has a sword and buckler. The knight wears his sword. The yeoman carries a sword, a shield, and a bow so expertly maintained that his arrows never lose their feathers. Nobody in the tale objects to this. Nobody's weapons are confiscated at a checkpoint, because the reality of the medieval road was that carrying a blade, some kind of blade, was considered by most people to be simple common sense. The roads were dangerous. Everyone knew this. The law acknowledged this too. Even strict readings of the Statute of Northampton generally exempted travellers in transit, recognising that a man riding a long road between towns was in a fundamentally different position than a man walking through a city market with a weapon strapped to his hip. The distinction was not really about the weapon. It was about intent and context. Were you going to use it to terrify your neighbours, disturb the market, intimidate the king's officers? That was what the law prohibited. Were you carrying it because you had 4 more days on the road through forest and moorland where you could be robbed without witness? That was considered reasonable. Now, the question of what weapons were actually permissible for whom and where, this varied enormously across Europe and across time. And I find the variations fascinating because each one tells you something different about what a particular society was actually afraid of. Nuremberg in the 13th through 15th centuries was by all accounts the strictest city in the German-speaking world on this question. The law there forbade residents from carrying swords or other weapons at all on pain of a fine plus confiscation of the weapon. Fines were doubled for bringing weapons into public houses. The only exceptions were public officials and travellers passing through on their way in or out of the city, and even those travellers had to leave their swords behind at their inn once they stopped moving. Only ordinary bread knives that are not dangerous and also not too sharp were permitted for residents. Nuremberg's laws were harsh even by late medieval standards. Many other German cities allowed their citizens to carry swords during the 15th century. In Augsburg, restrictions were loosened for locals to apply only to exposed or unusual weapons. In 15th century Rothenburg, knives with blades up to around 15 centimetres were allowed, which permitted a respectable self-defence tool even if it fell short of a proper sword. English law, despite the Statute of Northampton, operated somewhat differently in practice. In 1393, Richard II issued a proclamation forbidding anyone of whatever rank from going armed or girt with a sword, whereby the peace may be broken. But legal scholars note that this was issued specifically in the aftermath of the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, a time of acute royal anxiety about armed commoners, and was not enforced as a general prohibition on carrying ordinary personal weapons. What the law actually targeted in England and across most of Europe was not the knife or the short sword of the traveller. It was the military formation, the armour, the organised armed retinue that a powerful lord might ride with through a town, implicitly threatening the peace simply by the scale and equipment of the force. The Statute of Northampton was really about powerful people acting like they were above the law, not about a dyer from Bristol carrying a blade on a 5-day journey to market. There is one weapon that cuts across all of these distinctions, literally cuts across the class system, the legal framework and the Church's moral architecture in a way that is worth pausing on. The crossbow. In 1139, the Second Lateran Council declared the crossbow a weapon so horrifying in its indiscriminate power that it was banned for use against Christians. Against Saracens and other non-Christians, apparently it remained quite acceptable. But between Christian peoples, the crossbow was condemned by the Church as immoral, not because of its lethality per se, but because of what it represented. A crossbow could be operated effectively by a person with almost no training. It required no years of practice on horseback, no aristocratic upbringing, no lifetime of physical conditioning. It was a mechanical device that put killing power in the hands of anyone who could pull a trigger. That terrified the knightly class. A mounted knight in full armour had spent his entire life training for war. His position in society was built on the assumption that he was better at fighting than anyone else. The crossbow erased that assumption in an instant. A peasant with a crossbow and 10 minutes of instruction could kill a knight who had spent 30 years becoming a warrior. This was not primarily a theological objection. It was a class objection wearing theological clothes, and the ban was almost universally ignored. Crossbows appeared in military conflicts throughout the 12th, 13th and 14th centuries, used by all sides, including the most pious of Christian armies. Richard I of England, who died from a crossbow wound at Charlus-Chabrol in 1199, was killed by a weapon his own forces routinely deployed. The Church's prohibition was real. The world simply declined to follow it. What does a traveller actually carry then at the end of all this legal complexity? The honest answer is, whatever they thought they needed, calibrated by how visible they wanted to be, and how much they wanted to argue about it if stopped. A wealthy merchant on a major road between two large cities with a safe conduct document and a sealed letter from a bishop might ride with a sword openly displayed and expect no interference. His status was visible in his clothing, his horse, his documents. He was clearly not a vagrant, not a bandit, not a robber knight. He was a respectable man on legitimate business, who had the right, within the messy medieval understanding of that right, to protect himself. A poor pilgrim carrying the staff and scrip relied on the legal protection that the pilgrim uniform provided. As we discussed in Part 2, the pilgrim's dress functioned as a kind of passport, and that passport included implicitly the assumption that attacking a pilgrim was a crime against God and society, both not merely against the individual. The pilgrim's protection was in their visibility, not their armament. And then there was everyone in between the students, the ordinary travellers, the seasonal workers moving from town to town who carried what they could get away with and hoped they would not need it. Here is what I keep returning to thinking about all of this. The medieval debate about violence, who may use it, when against whom, under what authority is not a relic. It has not ended, it is ongoing. The Statute of Northampton, that 14-line document issued by a king who has been dead for nearly 700 years, was cited before the United States Supreme Court in 2021 in a case about concealed carry permits in New York State, a medieval weapons law from 1328 drafted to deal with armed knights terrorizing English towns in the aftermath of a period of political chaos, was being used to argue about the Second Amendment. That is not a curiosity. That is a reminder that these questions about the ethics of violence, the rights of individuals to protect themselves, and the state's legitimate interest in controlling who walks armed through a public space, these questions are as alive today as they were in the 14th century. The merchants and pilgrims on the road in 1290 would recognize the argument instantly. They had it every time they packed for a journey. We have now covered almost everything a medieval traveller carried. Everything from the staff blessed by a priest at the altar, to the knife on the hip from the sealed document in the bag, to the badge pinned to the hat, from the itinerary memorized before departure to the ampulla of holy water brought home and broken open in a field. But there is one final thing I want to talk about. Not an object, not a document, not a legal right. A person. A single person whose story draws together almost everything we have explored in this series. The dangers of the road, the weight of what they carried, the transformation of the journey, the moment of coming home changed, and whose name it turns out almost none of us know. That last chapter of the road waits just ahead. There is a man I want to tell you about. His name is Felix. Felix Fabri, a Dominican friar from Ulm in what is now southern Germany, born around 1441, died in 1502. By all accounts, an ordinary churchman, well-read, devout, not particularly powerful, not particularly famous. And yet Felix Fabri did something that almost no one in his century did. He made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem twice. The first time in 1480, a journey that took him from Germany to Venice across the eastern Mediterranean by galley, through Jaffa up to the Holy City itself. The second time in 1483, he went further Jerusalem again, then south through the desert to the Sinai, across to Egypt through Cairo and Alexandria, and finally home. The full round trip, both journeys combined somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 miles. He wrote it all down, every day, every storm at sea, every corrupt official, every inn that smelled like a farmyard, every moment of genuine trembling awe. The result is one of the longest and most detailed personal accounts of medieval travel that has survived a manuscript called the Evagatorium, running to thousands of pages. Scholars who study it today use words like vivid, evocative, and this one I particularly love, sometimes very funny. Felix Fabry wrote the way a person talks when they've been somewhere that changed them and they cannot stop describing it. And here is the detail that I find quietly devastating. Before his first pilgrimage, Felix had studied everything he could find about the Holy Land. He had read every account, memorized every route description, annotated every pilgrimage manual he could locate. He told himself he was prepared. He told himself he knew what to expect. He later wrote, and I am paraphrasing closely here, that on his first visit, he had rushed through Jerusalem almost hastily overwhelmed, unable to take it all in. He felt, in his own words, like a man reading a letter too fast in bad light. He knew the words were there. He could not absorb them. That is why he went back. The second time he went slowly. I've been thinking about Felix Fabry for the entire duration of this series, even though until now I've never mentioned him directly. Because he is, I think, the truest example of something I have been trying to describe across these 12 parts. Not the famous traveller. Not Marco Polo with his silks and his stories of the Great Khan's court. Not Marjorie Kemp, eccentric and magnificent, weeping her way across 3 continents. Not the merchant whose bills of exchange financed half of Europe's commerce. Just a man trained to think carefully who went somewhere hard and came back different, and then went again to understand why. He carried all of the things we've discussed. The staff, the cloak, the modest bag. He had his documents, a letter of safe conduct from the Bishop of Ulm, his travelling companions, the collective legal protection of a formal pilgrimage. He had his knife. He had his small pharmacopoeia of herbs and remedies, and probably at least one charm sewn into his clothing alongside the relics. He navigated by the itinerary descriptions his predecessors had left behind, by the churches on the horizon, by asking strangers at every crossroads. He slept in monastery guest houses, and when no monastery was available, in commercial inns, whose quality he assessed with the sharp eye of a man who had learned to tell the difference between a decent innkeeper and a thief with a spare mattress. He was in every practical sense a typical medieval long-distance traveller, and he came home carrying Syrian silks and a small basket of pebbles from the road to Sinai. That last detail. A basket of pebbles. Not relics. Not a precious memento with legal or theological status. Just stones from a road in the desert carried thousands of miles in a bag back to a room in a convent in Ulm. To remind himself every time he looked at them of the quality of the light on that road, and the heat and the sound of the sand under his feet, and the fact that he had been there. Let me ask you something. Have you ever come home from somewhere that required real effort to reach somewhere you had to work to get to, and found yourself standing in your own kitchen or your own bedroom, and for just a moment it felt slightly unreal, like the familiar space no longer quite fit you the way it used to? That feeling has a name in modern psychology. It is sometimes called re-entry disorientation. The traveller returns changed. The home has not changed. The mismatch takes time to resolve. Medieval people did not have that term, but they knew the feeling. They wrote about it in ways that are immediately recognizable across 700 years. Felix Fabry described the strange grief of leaving Jerusalem on his second pilgrimage, the sense that every step away from it was a small loss. He wrote that as the walls of the city disappeared behind him, He felt something leave him that he did not know how to name. He had been there. He had walked the same stones. He was walking away. Felix Fabry was a theologian. He had good language for most of the experiences in his life. And this one coming home from somewhere that had changed you, he struggled to describe it. That feels true to me. That feels like something that has not changed at all. Across this entire series, I have tried to do something specific. Not just to list what medieval travellers carried, though we have covered quite a lot of that in considerable detail, including some things that might surprise anyone who still thinks the medieval world was simply brutal and ignorant and small. The pilgrim staff blessed at the altar, which was simultaneously a walking tool, a legal document and a declaration of identity. The wool cloak, which turns out to be a more sophisticated piece of technology than most modern synthetic fabrics, because 7 centuries of sheep breeding had optimized it in ways that chemistry is still trying to replicate. The scrip, the deliberately small bag which was not just a container but a theological statement about what you were willing to let go of when you left your front door. The food, the twice-baked bread, the salted herring travelling from the North Sea to Constantinople, the small ale that was not a sign of alcoholism but of good sense in a world without reliable water treatment. The knife carried by nearly everyone, symbol of freedom for those who were legally entitled to carry it, object of genuine social anxiety for the authorities who tried to regulate it, and so integral to daily life that one historian compared it to a modern phone. The documents, the sealed letters and safe conducts and merchant marks which were the invisible infrastructure of trust in a world that had no centralized identity system and which worked astonishingly well because everyone agreed to honor them. The herbs and charms and pilgrim badges that layered pragmatic, intellectually consistent medicine kit that blended what we would now call genuine pharmacology with what we would call superstition, because medieval people understood correctly that the distinction between the two is often thinner than we pretend. The itinerary memorized before departure, the church tower on the horizon, the stranger at the crossroads who knew the road ahead and might choose to tell the truth about it, the inn with its stable and its shared beds, the monastery guest house with its theological obligation of welcome, the ordinary household that took in a traveller simply because the road was long and the night was coming, and that was what people did. And then at the end of it, the question of whether you were allowed to protect yourself while carrying all of this, and how the answer to that question shifted depending on who you were, what you wore, what century it was, and which city you happened to be riding through. Here is what I want to say at the end of all of this. We have a habit, and I catch myself doing it too, so this is not a criticism, just an observation of thinking of the medieval world as a kind of prehistory of the modern one, a rough draft, the place where humanity was working out some preliminary ideas before getting to the real thing. But the people on those roads were not rough drafts of anything. They were fully realized human beings navigating a world of extraordinary complexity, with tools that were finely adapted to that complexity, and with inner lives that were exactly as rich and anxious and hopeful and exhausted as ours. The student who walked from somewhere in England to Bologna to study law, sleeping in monastery guest houses, carrying his letters from his bishop, and his 2 weeks of food and a knife that he hoped he would never need, he was not less human than a student today flying to a graduate program with a laptop in a backpack. He was differently circumstanced. He was navigating different constraints, but the experience of leaving home and travelling towards something you want badly enough to suffer for, that has not changed. The experience of arriving somewhere you have read about your whole life, and finding that no description quite prepared you, that has not changed. The experience of putting something from the road into your bag to carry home because you want to have a piece of the place with you after the place is gone, that has not changed. Felix Fabry with his basket of Sinai pebbles, the pilgrim at Compostela pressing her badge against the reliquary before pinning it to her hat, the merchant wrapping his merchant's mark around the neck of a bolt of Flemish cloth, so that his identity would travel with his goods across 500 miles of roads he would never walk himself. They were all doing the same thing we do. They were trying to hold on to what mattered. They were trying to carry home something that could not fit in a bag. Shane Aaron Lagasse, in his book The Medieval Invention of Travel, published by the University of Chicago Press, makes a claim that I have been turning over in my mind since I first encountered it. He argues that the Middle Ages did not merely participate in the history of travel. He argues that the Middle Ages invented travel in the modern sense, the idea that going somewhere in itself transforms who you are. The ancient world had travellers. It had merchants and soldiers and diplomats, but the systematic idea that the journey itself, not just the destination, not just the business conducted at the end, had value, had meaning, could change a person, and be worth writing about honestly from the inside, that idea crystallized in the medieval period. In the wave of pilgrimage literature that began in the 4th century and swelled to a flood by the 13th, in the merchant accounts that began to treat the road not just as the space between profitable transactions, but as a world worth describing. In Felix Fabry working harder in his books before departure, his words than he did on the road itself, because he understood that seeing clearly requires preparation, and that preparation is itself a form of respect for the journey. We inherited this from them. Every travel essay, every road memoir, every anxious pre-flight list of what to pack and what to leave behind, all of it, traces back in some unbroken line to the woman pinning her staff to the church door when she arrived at Rome, and the man writing in the firelight of a monastery guest house about where he had been that day and what it meant. And so this is where I leave you. On the road. Not at the destination, not back home. On the road itself, which is, I think, the only honest place to end a journey like this one. Somewhere between a village you left weeks ago and a city you can almost see on the horizon, your feet are sore, and your bag is lighter than it was but heavier than you expected. You have eaten most of your twice-baked bread. You have slept in 3 monasteries and 1 inn that you're trying not to think too hard about. You have asked directions from 4 strangers and believed 3 of them, and you are wearing a small badge on your hat that shows where you have been. You are cold in the mornings and too warm by midday. You know the road ahead better than you knew it when you left because you have been learning it as you walk. You're not the same person who packed this bag. You keep going. That is what the medieval traveller taught us. You keep going. Thank you. That is all I can say at the end of something like this, and it feels both insufficient and exactly right. Thank you for sitting with me through 12 parts of this. Thank you for staying with the details, the iron ferrule on the walking staff, the tiny lead badge pressed against a reliquary in Santiago the Candle at the monastery guest house that was more generous than what the monks kept for themselves. These details matter. They are the proof that real people lived these lives, not illustrations in a manuscript, not symbols in a theology. Real specific people with blistered feet and opinions about innkeepers and small baskets of pebbles from desert roads they could not bear to leave behind. History is always like this when you get close enough. Always smaller and more human than the grand narrative, and always somehow larger because of it. If any part of this found you at the right moment, if something we discussed tonight is going to linger a little longer than you expected, I'm glad. That is all a storyteller can hope for. Rest well now. The next road is already waiting.